Cross, Shifter's Forever Worlds Book 22, by Ella Thorne.
Chapter 1. Cruz scratched at his jawline. The bearded growth there made a sound like dried grass being crunched. The beard, not really a beard such as it was. No mountain man beard, for this former compliance enforcer of the Shifter's Supreme Council. He shaved every so often then, in between, let it grow into a scruffiness that irritated the piss out of him. He was almost at the top of the mountain. Cragg's Peak, one of the 3 peaks of the sister mountains that compose the Bear Canyon mountain range. His peak. His forest. His mountain. He'd never stopped thinking of it as his, from the moment he'd laid eyes on the peak from far down below, scouting with his brothers. And it was his. Not far from the top, almost at Cragg's Peak, Cross stood next to a pine tree, not completely hidden by the trunk, blamed his wide shoulders, a legacy of the Del Cruz men, judging by his brothers and his own shoulders. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and studied the little fawn that lay in a bed of leaves, pine needles, and soft dirt. The fawn wasn't resting, not at all. Its tiny hoof was caught in the roots of an upturned tree. Every few moments the slight rust-colored creature would stir, flail, bleat. From a few yards away, its mother watched with a wary eye, probably hoping it will shut up before it attracts any predators. Predators. Like me. Except Cross didn't consider himself a predator. He may be a grizzly shifter, but he didn't prey on injured, trapped baby deer. Then again, Cross didn't intend to leave the fawn alone and vulnerable. No, he had a plan. Step 1 was to make sure there weren't any predators in the immediate vicinity. The tiny creature's cries and thrashing could easily attract wolves or bears. A moment longer. Still no signs of predators. Not that a bear or a wolf worried a grizzly shifter like Cross. Hell no. More like, Cross figured, the little fawn would probably die of heart failure if Cross had to shift and battle a predator in front of the baby deer. For sure it would croak from fear. Cross stepped out from behind the tree. The brown mama deer's ears twitched. Her eyes widened with fear. A shudder made her skin quiver, but she didn't raise a hoof, neither fleeing nor approaching. Could she smell the grizzly in him? He used hunter's block to keep other shifters from scenting him, but would it keep his scent from the deer? It was bad enough she'd smell the human in him. That was probably alarming. The little one released a yelp, followed by more floundering when it saw Cross. He gazed at it, staring into the dark eyes, trying to reassure the baby he meant it no harm. Yeah, like I'm some fucking deer whisperer. In Cross's head, his bear growled. Yeah. I know. Bears don't save deer. Cross and his bear didn't always agree on matters. Fact was, his teen years had been hell with his bear. But that was then. And yet, even though in the presence of a bear shifter, the baby hushed and lay perfectly still, Cross made his way with stealth, wary of unwanted intruders. He knelt next to the little one, placed one hand on its quivering torso to stabilize it, and freed the large knuckle, trapped between 2 roots, yielding enough to capture the hoof but not to release it. With the baby's leg freed, he took his hand off the soft fur, fingertips dragging across slowly, relishing the suppleness. Rising to his feet, Cross backed away. The fawn leapt up, gave one false start that made Cross hold his breath and say a tiny prayer. Then it took off like a shot, joining its mama, with one last backward glance at the grizzly shifter who'd saved him. A smile made its way to Cross's face. A rarity for him. Not that he didn't enjoy smiling, but he tended to be on the intense side. He'd traveled fairly deep into the mountains of Bear Canyon mountain range, seeking Cragg's Peak. Every so often, he made the trek. Not only for the majestic beauty of the view of the mountain range and Bear Canyon Valley down below, but because that was the place he'd set up the antenna, capturing signal. The same signal that traveled through underground wiring and fed his equipment with the information the digital age offered. Just because I live in a remote area doesn't mean I can afford to be out of touch. Especially not a man who'd been in his line of work. Once an enforcer, always an enforcer. So he trekked to Cragg's Peak every few days, or couple weeks, to double-check everything. Not that he minded the view. Lies. He loved the view. He'd loved it since he was a teen, and would leave his foster mother's home to climb to this peak. He'd leave for days on end, living off the land, scaring the shit out of Mae Forester, his foster mother. Sometimes he'd take his brothers with him, and sometimes he'd slip out to be left alone. His brothers got it. Both Lance and Judge had each claimed one of the other peaks as their own. Each had set up a cabin on the mountain they'd claimed. Each had purchased the land around them. 3 brothers orphaned, given a home by Mae, the widow of Brad Forester. The Cruz brothers were too old to need a mother, but not too old to need the influence of an older woman to guide them and temper their decisions. Mae Forester had been good to them, until, one by one, all 3 boys had taken the same path, joining the Compliance Division of the Shifter Supreme Council as enforcers. Cross hadn't kept up with Mae like he should have. Guilt ate at him for that. He'd get an occasional email from her, and once in a while, she'd leave a message on his voicemail. He'd been a teen when he moved in with her, and he'd been just out of his teens when he left her home to train as an enforcer. His time at Mae's had been his happiest. He'd been close to his brothers back then, much closer than he was now. He'd even been close to Fiona, a falcon shifter Mae had given a home. He climbed the last few feet and stood on the large boulder. His acute shifter sight allowed him to view the area below him with the sharpness of an eagle. Nothing was amiss on his mountain. It was still isolated, still uninhabited, still a haven from the world. A lonely haven. Mae's words from long ago echoed in his mind. "You can't lock yourself away from the world," she'd said. "Cross, you need to live. You're one to speak, Aunt Mae. You have no one in your life. I have you. Your brothers. Fiona. And countless others." Her smile had been sad. He knew she missed Brad. Shifters mated for life. She wasn't a shifter, but once she'd couple bonded with Brad, that had sealed their love in a vacuum that was eternal. And still, he'd always wished she'd found someone. Found some happiness. I should pay her a visit. He hadn't told Mae he was back at Bear Canyon. She probably thinks I'm still an enforcer.
Chapter 2. Ariadne Fueller tapped the brake pedal and avoided looking into the rearview mirror. She'd already seen her swollen eyes bloodshot from crying for days on end. She wrapped her fingers around the old locket on her neck, seeking comfort she wouldn't find. This was not the time for sentimentality. So this is Bear Canyon Valley. What the hell had Fiona been thinking, sending her here? Ariadne and Fiona had been close once, during college. As close as sisters. Fiona had shared with Ariadne that when she was very little, Mae Forester had adopted her, and she'd grown up in a quiet little place called Bear Canyon Valley. Then Fiona had gone into some sort of law enforcement after college, and Ariadne had gone a completely different direction. And then, when Ariadne had no one to turn to, no access to her accounts, credit cards, property, she'd reached out to the only person who wasn't connected to her current life. Fiona. Who also happened to be the only person she could trust. It was as if all that time and all their differences vanished. Fiona had jumped into action, made sure she had funds, and told her to go to Forester Cut Salon in Bear Canyon Valley. "Talk to Mae," Fiona said. "She knows what to do." But Ariadne hadn't told Fiona the situation, not really. "Listen, just go see Mae. She fixes things. And people. I'm not broken," Ariadne had wanted to tell Fiona. But she knew that wasn't completely true. She glanced at the handwritten note scratched out on the back of a diner's receipt. The note read, "Mae Forester. Forester Cut Salon. 1456 Elm Street. Bear Canyon Valley." Moments later, checking the numbers over a door, Ariadne realized she had passed Mae's beauty salon, Forester Cuts. She scanned the sidewalk in front of the shop. Nothing special, the street was empty, no guys waiting for her. No one anticipating her next move, ready with a silenced flock. A sigh of relief exited her lungs in a whoosh. Her stomach released the knots it held hostage. She pulled into the parking lot on the side and studied the sign blowing in the wind on the desolate street. Fiona used to tell her stories about how they rolled up the sidewalks early in Bear Canyon. Guess it was true. She fidgeted, glanced at the note. Mae Forester. She looked back up at the sign. Quit stalling, she told herself. She opened the door. A blast cool of air greeted her. She went to close it again, but only got halfway. The door was blocked. She lifted her gaze to the source. A tall man, wide chest, broad shoulders, and large hands held the door. Can I help you, miss? No, I'm fine, thank you. She glanced at his hand pointedly, hoping he'd take a hint and let go of the door. She was ready to bolt. You've been going back and forth about going into Forester Cuts. Was he watching me? Who is he? Fierce fingers traveled across Ariadne's spine. The flash drive tucked safely into the front pocket of her jeans felt like it was burning a hole straight through to her skin. She was sure the man thought his smile was supposed to put her at ease. Right now, she didn't think anything could do that. My mate wife works here. He stuck a hand out. Grant Waters. Chelsea, my wife, cuts hair for Mae. Mae Forester? She stepped out of her car and shook his hand, making sure she didn't say her name. God, that's all I need, for someone to know who I am. That's right. You need Mae. He made a silent, curious assessment. I'm supposed to see her. Come on. He indicated for Ariadne to precede him toward the front door. With a backward glance at her car, wishing she'd not been put in this spot, Ariadne reluctantly followed him. Grant Waters opened the door to the salon and indicated for her to go in first. A blonde flew out of the back, a little less curvy than Ariadne. She bypassed Ariadne and flung herself into Grant's open embrace. Ready? The blonde had a purse in one hand and her coat in the other. Then, as if realizing just at that moment that Ariadne was there, she looked her up and down. Hi. Concern slipped over her features before she hid it with a smile. You have an appointment. Grant laughed. Don't worry. We have plenty of time to make it to our reservations. She's not here for a haircut, though. She's here to see Mae. I'm Chelsea. The blonde glanced at Grant. Chelsea Waters. She smiled sheepishly. Still getting used to that. Newlyweds? Ariadne asked, trying to be polite. You could say that. Grant held Chelsea's coat for her while she slipped her arms in. Mae's in the back. I'll go get her. She buttoned her top button, kissed Grant, and turned around. It's okay. Ariadne moved to intercept her. You two have reservations. I'll go get her. Plus, the less eyes and ears around, the better. You sure? Chelsea stopped mid-stride. Absolutely. Ariadne took several paces toward the rear of the shop, as if it was totally normal for her to be doing this, as if she'd been here before. She glanced over her shoulder at the couple near the door, staring at each other, then made shooing motions. Enjoy dinner. The door closed behind them as she pulled the door to the back room open. An attractive, dark-skinned brunette looked up from the towels she was taking out of a dryer. She cocked her head. It seemed her eyes flashed an indigo color for a second. I'm clearly sleep-deprived. Mae? The brunette nodded. Then her face lit up. Ariadne. I guess Fi called you. Hope she didn't tell her too much. Not that Fiona knows everything anyway. She did. Mae shoved the last towel into the basket. You don't look so well. She laid a comforting hand on Ariadne's shoulder. Folding can wait. Let's get you to cross. Where's that? Not where. Who? Fine then. Who's that? He's sort of like my nephew. Sort of like your nephew? Ariadne felt bad for asking questions, particularly since she wasn't willing to answer any about herself, but how in the hell could someone be a sort of nephew? Adopted, more or less. Again with the vagueness. What the hell is more or less adopted? And it's not that I don't trust you. Fiona trusted Mae, but it wasn't as though Ariadne knew her. But how is it he can help me? What did Phi tell her I need? Cross can help almost anyone with anything. Great. A MacGyver sort of guy. He better be packing more than duct tape and paper clips if he's going to help me. I'm not sure this is such a great idea, Mae. I didn't really tell Phi everything, and I don't know if it's fair for you to try to help me when you don't know what I need. She said money would be a temporary fix for what you need help with. Ariadne nodded. True enough. Money would only get her so far. What was that saying? You can run but you can't hide. So what could this cross guy do to help her? Probably some geek that can give me a new identity and passport and all that. Maybe that wasn't such a bad idea. Chapter 3. About an hour later, Ariadne was playing driver to Mae, following her directions, taking a road up a mountain. The higher Ariadne drove, the narrower the road became, and the steeper the incline grew. This wasn't a good time to mention she had a fear of heights. She avoided looking out the window because, every now and then, when there was a break in the trees, she caught a glimpse of how high they'd traveled. I hope he's home. Maybe I should have called him. Do you want to call him now? She glanced at the scowl on Mae's attractive profile. No. Cross is different. He isn't always, Mae frowned as if searching for just the right word, up for visitors. Mae finished with a smile Ariadne could only describe as weak, on a good day. Great. An antisocial nerd who lives on a mountain. Lovely. I'm so screwed. Stop. Mae screeched the words out. Ariadne slammed on the brakes, sending both of them pitching forward, their seatbelts saving from smacking the dash. Here, pull in here. Where? Ariadne studied the wooded area, out the side window. There. Mae pointed. That's not even a road. It's sort of the driveway, just a little longer. Crunching beneath her tires, and near encounters with trees while bushes brushed against her car, characterized the moments it took for Ariadne to reach a cabin set in a grove. She felt like she'd been transported back in time, to the era of frontiersmen. This wasn't the kind of place she'd expect a forger to live in. God, I've watched too many spy movies. Ariadne pulled up in front of the cabin. Mae jumped out and headed for the front door. Ariadne followed, climbing the steps slowly. She paused to take in the tranquility of the cabin's surroundings. Peaceful. That was the only way she could describe the place. A haven away from the hustle and bustle of the world. It was purity and silence. Mae's knock on the solid wooden door broke the forest's quiet. She crossed her arms, waiting. When there was no response after a moment, she knocked again. This time Mae tapped her foot on the cedar planks that composed the cabin's front porch. She looked at Ariadne, smiled sheepishly. Maybe I should have called. Ariadne gave a small shrug and raised her brows. There was no way to know. After 30 impatient seconds, Mae huffed in exasperation. He's probably fishing at the stream. She glanced at Ariadne's heels. I'll go get him. Why don't you wait in the car? Safer there. Safer from what? Ariadne glanced around. Bears. Wolves. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Ariadne. Great. I'm trying to stay alive, and here I come to a forest where a bear or wolf could possibly eat me. I'll be back in a bit. The stream's a good 15 or 20-minute hike. With that, Mae was gone. Bears. Wolves. Really? I'd think they'd stay away from people and their homes. She leaned against the black hood of the car she had paid cash for. It had barely made the trip. The snap of a twig breaking made her change her mind. Quickly. She jumped in the car. Ariadne waited as patiently as she could, but after 30 minutes had lapsed and her bladder was threatening to rebel, she had to make a tough decision. I'm not peeing in the woods. Not while I might get attacked. She eyed the cabin. Surely she could borrow the facilities for a quick second. Please, please, please don't be locked. She hoped this cross guy didn't think she was merely being nosy. Nosy had nothing to do with it. She needed to tinkle. End of story. And she needed to do it bad. She jumped out of the car and wasted no time hastening up the few porch steps to the front door. Knocking was clearly useless, since it had done Mae no good at all. She tried the knob. If that didn't work. She grimaced at the idea she'd have to use the bushes to the side and bare her ass while she was vulnerable to an attack. She could see the local headlines. Unidentified woman mauled by bear while pants were gathered around her ankles. She snorted a small laugh. Then turned the door handle. It gave instantly. Well, of course. What did I expect? Who would lock their doors out here? It was not like anyone could happen on this place, accidentally. And suddenly, she found herself a little envious of this nerdy guy called Cruz who forged identities. She had this mental image of him. Short, skinny, glasses, hair that hadn't been washed in a good week if not more. A knit cap hiding most of that unwashed hair. She slipped through the doorway, closed the door behind her and took stock of the cabin. The owner was clearly not a slob. The space was immaculate. Almost with military precision. Nothing out of place, everything ordered and orderly. That seemed out of character for the kind of guy she figured he was. Now where's the restroom? She spied a hallway with several doors. All closed. She opened the first one. Whoops. A bedroom. She closed the door quickly, feeling like an intruder. On to the next one. She opened the door slowly, apprehensive about violating the guy's privacy again. Whoa. Jesus. What the fuck is this? She surveyed the room, all thoughts of her full bladder gone. The room looked like a control room at NORAD or NASA. Bookshelves lined two walls, but instead of literary works, it appeared as though they were 3-ring binders or manuals. 3 desks were tucked in between the bookshelves. Monitors covered the other 2 walls, with a large executive-type chair on an elevated platform set strategically to watch the screens. Lights blinked on screens, computer fans whirred quietly, a radio on one of the desks made a low static sound. It resembled a radio she'd seen on an old wartime movie. This was no ordinary forger's cabin. This was no ordinary man's cabin at all. What kind of work did this cross guy do that would require this kind of technology? The practical side of her wondered where the hell he got internet from. A creak came from behind her. Her face chilled, the blood pulled from it. I can only hope that's Mae. But would Mae have come in? She hadn't earlier. She turned slowly, readying a smile, trying to appear harmless. First thought, he's huge. Second thought, he's hot. Now, why the hell would she think that, when this man was regarding her with an expression that threatened bodily harm if not death? Because, truthfully, he was unbelievably handsome. No man had a right to be this good of vision. His face was composed of angles and planes, brought together perfectly to create a modern-day, rustic Greek god of war. Broad chest tapered to a V. Wide shoulders, no pencil neck, a scruffy beard that did nothing to hide sensuous lips. But heaven help her, it wasn't just looks. He had this air about him. She couldn't peg it even though his eyes were hard, jaw chiseled. You're trespassing. That voice. It flowed like honey on a warm day, with a slight hint of a lilt to it, as though maybe he'd spent some time overseas, though she couldn't place the accent. I didn't mean to be. I needed to use the restroom. A likely story. This looked like McDonald's to you? No, you see. Save it. Before she could finish her sentence, before she could anticipate, with a speed she'd never have expected from such a tall, big guy, she was facing the wall, her cheek pressed against it roughly, a hand over her mouth while her wrists were held behind her back by his other large hand. Who sent you? She tried to respond, but the only sound she could make behind the fingers over her lips was a muffled, whiny whimper. Shut up. I don't know who's out there, but you make a sound, you're a dead woman. Really? I left the city to save my life, and now this? She shook her head to let him know she was in agreement. He removed his hand slowly, then she heard rustling, felt something tight on her wrists, then heard a zipping sound. Her hands were bound tight. He roughly flipped her around to face him, a zip tie clenched between his straight white teeth. His eyes were a dark chocolate brown, with a ring of gold on the outer perimeter of his irises. He ripped the zip tie from his mouth, slipped it into a pocket, then pulled out a bandana. Open wide. His voice wasn't much more than a whispered hiss. She gave him a look. Seriously? Now. And shut up. I meant it about being dead. They'd never find your body out here. Or the body of whoever is out there. She opened her mouth. He shoved the fabric in. She fought back a gag at the thought of what it may have been used for. He'd regret it when Mae showed up. He'd eat crow. She would storm out of here. Fuck him and his help. What if he's not Cross? What if he's an intruder and has already killed Cross? What if he was bluffing when he accused me of trespassing? Too late to sort that out now. Wait. Fuck. What if he killed Mae already? He led her to the other room. Her bladder protested the procrastination. Now it's back. Don't make a sound, he said with a low voice. Sit on the couch. Not a sound. Got it? He stared at her, waiting. Well? Ariadne nodded.
Chapter 4. Cross stared at the woman sitting on his couch. In his head, his bear was making grumbling and growling sounds. Cross didn't want to hear the message the bear was sending. Not now. His bear was attracted to the woman. He'd never done this before. No female had ever pulled his bear's attention. Quit already. I have to figure out what the hell is going on here. His bear bellowed. Knock it off, would ya? As if his bear could really tell someone was their fated mate. Just like that. Yeah. Right. Okay, the hottie on the couch might be all that. And a damn bag of chips, thank you very much. Didn't mean she was the one. She glared at him, bandana stuffed in between her luscious lips. Her glare golden and green at the same time. A definite V pulling her brows down, distorting that pretty face with a frown. Bottom line, no matter how hot, she was a fucking trespasser. And who the hell sent her? What the fuck was this about? The car outside had out-of-state plates. He'd seen another set of prints leading toward the woods, small shoe, not heels. He glanced at the shoes of the delectable woman on his couch. They picked right. Under other circumstances, he'd have been interested in her. If she wasn't breaking into my house. If she hadn't found my control center. If I didn't think she'd try to kill me. He let his eyes travel slowly over the woman in black slacks, pumps, and a white top. No jacket. That's stupid, considering the mountain nights get chilly. Maybe she had one in the car. First order of business, find the other person. Also a woman, he figured. So whoever sent them clearly thought sending a woman would make their mission more successful. He put his fingers over his lips, letting her know silence was the only option. With a final glance at the brunette with the golden green eyes, he headed toward the front door. He stopped, alerted by the sound of a board groaning as if someone had taken a step onto his porch. He knew exactly which board it was. It spanned the entire length of the stairs on the second step from the top. He'd personally designed it and built it to make a sound, thereby alerting him when there were intruders on his porch. Cross took a step back. The door opened. Ariadne. He knew that voice. Cross. Yeah, he definitely knew that voice, though he hadn't heard it in person in a hell of a long time. Mae. He paused when she arched an eyebrow. Aunt Mae, he corrected himself. She stepped in the cabin, the woman who'd given him and his brothers a home when they were destitute, hopeless, as well as homeless. She sprinted toward him, wrapped her arms around his waist. Cross. Good to see you. Hi. Mae pulled away, her eyes on the woman on the couch. Was this Ariadne? Mae slapped Cross on the arm. The woman was struggling to get up but couldn't because his couch was low to the ground, and her hands were securely fastened behind her back. Cruz, Cruz. What have you done? She hurried toward the woman on the couch, ripped the bandana from her mouth and pulled her to her feet. Cut this off her. Cruz shrugged. She was trespassing. He reached into his pocket for his knife and flicked it open. Turn around. The trespasser was glaring at him, but she complied. He slipped the blade between her flesh and the tie and sliced it cleanly. The woman whirled around quickly. You never gave me a chance. You were trespassing. You have no rights. Just like you did now. You won't let me finish a sentence. Her face crunched into a grimace of pain. Restroom, please. She shifted from one leg to the other. Cruz laughed. He couldn't help it. The idea she'd been holding it, and now was about to start a pee-pee dance, was amusing. First door to the left. She gave him a pointed look. Not the right, he emphasized. Got it, she snapped. When she was safely out of earshot, he pulled Mae to the porch. What is she doing here? She's a human. You brought a human woman to my den, home. She needs help. She's Fiona's friend. Fiona. Who'd been as close as a sister to him. She'd been in New York for a spell when he'd been in the area. It had been good to see his foster sister. How's Fi doing? We didn't really have time to talk much. She's back together with Jonah. Cruz had met the polar bear shifter once, when he and Fiona had been together. Then Cruz had heard they'd split up, and Cruz hadn't seen either of them. Rumor had it Fiona had gone out of town. I hope she's happy. They seemed a good mating. Speaking of mating, Aunt Mae. You stop. Mae slapped his arm gently this time. I'm with Doc. A red color kissed her pretty face, highlighting the twinkling eyes. A flash of indigo traveled the depths. You're with Doc? When did that happen? He hadn't told her he'd figured out long ago she was an elemental, able to control the elements around them. He'd found out about elementals when he joined the compliance unit. He'd always wondered what the deal was with Mae's occasional eye color changes. Now he knew. Until she decided to mention it, he wasn't going to open up the topic. Not too long ago. What's time to a shifter anyway? It's not as though shifters live normal lifespans. True. His kind lived for eons, aging slowly, and weren't easy to kill, what with their accelerated hibernation healing powers. Cruz knew Mae's first mate was Grizzly. Jake Evans, called Doc, was also a Grizzly. He was happy Mae finally had someone in her life again. He should have noticed her couple bond status earlier. It wasn't visible, but it marked a mate with an aura often visible to other shifters and supernatural beings. He'd have noticed if he hadn't been distracted by the trespasser. The very hot trespasser, his bear corrected with a growl. Oh, now you show up. Seems you could have been on a higher state of alert. Like maybe noticing it was Mae's scent. Cruz and his bear had a rocky relationship. Both two alike. Both hard-headed, each wanting what he wanted, even if it was at odds with what the other one wanted. When he'd been a teen, he'd struggled with it greatly. Mae had tried to help him, but ultimately it came down to teen hormones and bear hormones clashing. Mae was watching him, expecting something. Maybe we should get together sometime, to celebrate your couple bonding with Doc. Yes, after you help Ariadne out. Cruz heaved a sigh. I don't freelance. You haven't heard her situation. He crossed his arms over his chest and tried to keep from appearing too foreboding, though he knew Mae wasn't intimidated, not in the least. What's her situation? Mae had the audacity to look sheepish. I'm not sure. Not really. He cocked his head, lifted one brow. Mae continued, her cheeks red as though embarrassed. You see, Fiona said she was close to her. That she needed help. She didn't say what kind. And you didn't ask her yourself when she got to Bear Canyon. Very unlike Mae not to find out things. She usually had her finger on the pulse of everything that happened in Bear Canyon Valley. She was at the core of the return of shifters to the valley after so many were killed off during shifter wars. I tried on the drive up. She's better than Fiona was at evading questions. Mae lowered her voice. I don't think she trusts me, and I'm pretty sure she's scared to death. He had noticed the red-rimmed eyes. That woman had been crying a lot for a while now. Mae. She gave him a look. Aunt Mae. It was odd calling her that, when now they almost appeared the same age. The couple bonded mates of shifters aged slowly, exactly as shifters did. Listen, I can't just take care of her. What does she need? A ride. He pointed to the car that appeared as if it might fall to pieces any minute. Want me to help her get a vehicle? No. Just watch her. He glared. Just for a couple days. No more. While I figure out what's wrong and how it can be fixed. How will you do that? I have my ways. Give me a chance. No doubt she does have her ways, but 2 days with this woman. When the last thing he wanted was to be around humans. When he needed to recharge his mind, body, soul, and bear. That was a lot to ask. He thought of the fawn from earlier. What am I? The guy who helps the lost and wounded. Then it occurred to him he'd once been lost and wounded. And Mae had been the only one who helped him and his brothers. But still, this left a question in his mind. Why? Why all this trouble for one human woman? Mae gave him a stern stare. Because she saved Fiona's life when they lived in New York together. She doesn't even know she saved her life. Fi didn't give me the details. Only said she wanted her protected, as if Ariadne was Fiona herself. Fuck. Cross knew what this would mean. And I told Fi I knew just the man who'd be able to help. I'd heard you'd finished your time with the compliance unit. God damn it. How did you hear that? These matters were highly confidential. The general public of shifters was not supposed to know the location or actions of a CU enforcer. Nor were they supposed to know when they left active duty. All enforcers served for 4 years, then were put out on a hiatus, with the option to re-enlist their services to the CU after that year. Mae shrugged. Tell me. I have a friend in New York. That damn polar bear shifter. Romanoff. He should have known. Mikhail Romanoff was to the New York territory what Mae was to Bear Canyon Valley. So now Fiona's debt would be his own. He nodded. Mae understood. Thank you, Cross. He grumbled under his breath. Didn't mean he had to like it. What about her car? Mae asked. Either you can take it down and have Grant hide it in one of the caves on his property. Or I can stash it up here until she's ready to go and run you into town. Oh, no need. Jake's on his way up to get me. You were that sure I'd do it? Cross wanted to be angry with her. You're a good man, Cross Del Cruz. You've always been good. I knew you'd do the right thing. I'll follow Doc down the mountain with her car. Just in case it can't make the trip. That thing looks like it's held together with duct tape and prayers. Perfect timing. Doc pulled up in his pickup, and Ariadne stepped onto the porch. Conversation over. Great. Just great.
Chapter 5. Ariadne stepped onto the porch. Whatever Mae and Cross had been discussing, they clammed up when they saw her. Of course it was about me. And somehow, for some damned reason she didn't want to explore, it bothered her. A truck drove up at that moment. A man almost as large as Cross stepped out. His eyes focused on Mae. Mae stepped into his embrace. How rude of me. Mae turned to Ariadne. This is Doc. Doc, Ariadne Fueller. She's staying with Cross. Cross grunted. It took Ariadne a second or two to process what Mae had said. Staying with Cross. Staying with Cross. Thought he was helping me, like maybe with a new identity. Wait, Ariadne began. I don't think. That's not what. You need to stay hidden. Mae stepped forward. That's what Fiona said. Not forever. I can't. Who could live like that? Just for a bit. Let me get something worked out. How the hell can Mae work anything out? The only thing that can be worked out is to have Ben Corbin dead. As if she had another choice. Ariadne swallowed any further protests she had. A few moments later, it was with a measure of sadness that Ariadne watched Doc and Mae drive away. She felt Cross's hard gaze on her back and was reluctant to turn around. Fuck it. She grabbed the bull by the horns. You could have told her no. He was leaning against the door jamb, his wide shoulders blocking the open door. She'd have to brush against him to enter. Told who no? Oh, so now he's going to play stupid. Mae. About me. His eyes narrowed. His jaw muscles worked. No. I couldn't have. His words were crisp. Why not? She took a step closer to the door, rubbing her arms as if she were cold. He didn't take the hint. He remained in place, unmoving. You wouldn't understand. What's that supposed to mean? Like I'm some sort of lower life form? He shook his head. She's practically family. Hell, she is family. You don't let family down. They don't let you down. And you don't think I'd understand that? Tears pricked her eyes at the thought of her father. Anger at Cross allowed her to push the thought aside, though she had never learned how to push it aside completely, not in months. His eyes locked on hers. She didn't blink for fear the tears would cascade. Think of something. Anything. Don't think of the hurt. Don't think of the betrayal. She asked the first question that popped into her head. What's up with that room you have set up like a scene from a war room in a sci-fi movie? Why do you need my help? Who are you running from? He spat the questions rapid fire, without delay. She glared at him, then turned her gaze to the wood that covered the porch. It was fresh, as though someone with an eye for detail had put a lot of love and work into it. Who was this mysterious man, with all the high-tech equipment in a rustic cabin setting? Though her curiosity was piqued, she found her focus had zeroed in on her problem. Could she use his computer? Would she be able to transfer the contents of the flash drive to an email and send it out? Would that put an end to her nightmare, or would she end up alone in a grave like her father? Would anyone be able to trace it back to here? Would it wreak havoc on Cross's life? Why do I care? And yet she did. Realizing he'd been silent for a few moments, she glanced up. Cross's gaze was focused on something in the forest. She glanced at the trees. A tiny deer was approaching the cabin on shaky legs. What the hell? Cross's tone was low, intense. Go back to your mother, he told the fawn. Instead, the fawn came closer. And closer. She noticed the blood on its shoulder. She gasped. Stay here. Don't move. Cross's tone brooked no argument. Cross stepped off the porch, his boots crunching lightly on the leaves as he took slow steps toward the fawn. He was murmuring something in a deep timbre, though she didn't recognize the words. Ariadne was sure the little deer was going to flee. But it didn't. Instead, the bloody forlorn creature approached Cross, knees buckling on unsteady hooves, until its head was almost touching just above Cross's knee. Ariadne watched transfixed, completely unable to look away. Cross squatted, lowered himself to one knee, the sounds of comfort still coming from his lips. The fawn stepped in between his legs, his head practically resting on Cross's shoulder. Cross leaned back, took his flannel shirt off and draped it over the fawn. She stared at his torso, faint and faded scars marked his body. Bullet wounds, stab wounds, and some that resembled claw marks. She wouldn't have been able to see the scars, had the sunlight not hit his body at exactly the right angle. She tried not to stare at his body, the muscular broad back, the way his tendons flexed in his forearms, the way they lined his neck. She'd never known a man like this. Ben hadn't brought out these emotions in her. She swallowed hard and found she'd been holding her breath. Ariadne drew the crisp, clean mountain air in. Her body and mind felt alive in a way she never had before. Her eyes stayed glued to the dark-haired, ruggedly handsome, hardened man before her. Muscles like that, scars like his, and a control room that would make NASA proud. What was his story? Who is he? To her bewilderment, she found herself drawn to him. Rubbing in slow circles, he removed most of the blood from its fur. Cross ran his fingers over the fawn gently, large hands moving with tenderness over the quivering fawn while its liquid brown eyes studied his face. Ariadne couldn't help staring at the scene before her. This tough, large man was ministering to the tiny, defenseless fawn while it almost seemed hypnotized by him. She took a step in their direction without realizing it, until the fawn looked right at her. She froze. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Cross. He wrapped the fawn loosely in the shirt and picked him up. "It's not his blood." "Then?" "Probably his mother's." Cross shook his head. "We have to go find her. If he left her to come here, if he's behaving like this, I'm not sure we'd like what we saw." The baby deer tucked its head under the jacket. His little twitching black nose was the only thing she could see. Cross heaved a sigh, sadness in that exhaled breath and in his eyes. "She was fine this morning." "You saw them?" His nod was slow, eyes scanning the forest. "Can you drive a stick? He's going to need some veterinary care. Plus, I can't take care of it while—" He cut himself off, but she knew what he was going to say. He couldn't take care of the deer while he was babysitting her. Guilt flooded through her. "I can go." He paused. "No." Another pause. "I need you." How could this self-sustaining man possibly need her?
Chapter 6. Cross's head snapped in her direction. He cursed himself at his insensitivity. His bear snarled at the idea she'd leave them. God damn it. He wished his bear would shut up with this mate business. But at the same time, the idea of her going away left a part of him feeling empty. It wasn't so much that he was attached to her, as it was he felt a drive to know her better. To know what made this woman tick. What made her run. What would make her stand and fight. He saw the compassion in her eyes for the fawn whose heartbeat Cross could feel against his chest. That look, coupled with her willingness to sacrifice whatever she was doing here, so he could take care of the little deer. Cross sighed. He couldn't let her walk away. He had to get to know her. Something in the depths of her golden green eyes pulled at him. No, he couldn't let her go. He studied her. The way her jaw stuck out with stubbornness. The way her cheeks reddened in a combination of embarrassment and anger at needing his help. No. Cross shook his head. You're not going. You don't owe me, she said. And I don't know what debt you feel you owe Mae or Fiona, but it doesn't extend to babysitting me. I need you. This time she did the double take. What? Can you drive a stick? I need you to drive while I hold him. An expression that may have been disappointment flashed across her face. Her fingers had reached up subconsciously, he was sure, and were touching the gold antique locket about her neck. I can drive a stick. My dad taught me. Sadness in her tone made him wonder where her father was. Why wasn't he helping her? Grab me a hoodie from the hook by the front door. With her assistance, he finagled the hoodie on, careful not to jostle the fawn, then led her to the shed, 25 yards from the house, and pulled the sliding wood door open. His old, reliable truck filled the shed. Keys are in the ignition. Ariadne held the door for him, in a reverse case of chivalry, while he climbed in with the fawn. The little fella was limp but still had a heartbeat. Maybe sleeping or maybe unconscious from shock. He pulled the door shut gently, hoping not to scare him. What a day the little one had. Is the vet in Bear Canyon Valley? Ariadne's tone gave him pause. She was afraid. Her face had grown pale. Something out there was making this woman fearful. No. Outside Bear Canyon Valley. He adjusted his legs, too long almost even for his truck. Mac's a vet, but not your average vet. Mac works for the Bear Canyon Wildlife Reserve. Mostly travels all over the region helping wildlife. Ariadne nodded tersely, her lips flattened in a worried line as she pulled out of the shed. They rode in silence as the truck bounced its way down the mountain. Ariadne. He liked the way her name sounded as it rolled off his tongue. He'd never met anyone with that name. Oh, who was he kidding? He never met women anyway. His line of work didn't really allow for that unless they were female shifters and associated with the Shifter Council. He'd never met someone who struck a chord with him. His bear huffed. And evidently she'd struck a chord with his bear. She glanced in his direction. What? I won't take risks with your safety. If I didn't think it would be safe to take you to Max, I wouldn't. Ariadne nodded. Her nod was interrupted by a gasp. He saw the same thing at the same time. Pull over. There on the side of the road, the fawn's mother. He didn't need to be an expert at autopsy to see the spot where the round had entered her body. Who the hell? Why didn't I hear a shot? Oh God. Ariadne whispered. She's gone. He's all alone. He's got no one. The way she said it, Cross wondered if she wasn't talking about herself as well. Cross had to get to the bottom of Ariadne's issue. Or find out if Mae had. Ariadne nosed the vehicle back onto the road that was more of a path. Cross gave her directions in a low tone. He hadn't been to Mac's place in years. But as far as he knew, it hadn't changed locations.
Chapter 7. Ariadne drove down the mountain slowly, very conscious of Cross's presence next to her. Something about the dynamic had changed between them. She had definitely seen a side of the man she hadn't expected. It was hard to hate him now. No, it was hard not to be attracted to him. She'd never met a man like this. Her mind traveled to Ben. Much different from Ben. Thank God. Turn left. He pulled her from her thoughts. Now right at the dirt road. Where the hell is this vet's office? They'd left the mountains behind, and were well into the valley but nowhere near the little town that housed Mae's hair salon. There wasn't a house in sight, nor any cars or people. She breathed a sigh of relief. She studied the image of the mountains in the background, appreciating the majesty and purity of the untouched scenery. This was a beautiful place. She could understand why someone would want to spend the rest of their lives here. If they didn't have a death sentence over their head. Pull in here. She pulled into the driveway in front of a large building and a small cottage-type cabin in front of it. The large building was a modified barn and office building, with pens made of chain link in the back. In front of the building was the small cottage. Ariadne turned the engine off and opened the door for Cross so he wouldn't have to juggle the little one while he tried to manipulate the handle blocked by the fawn's body. Cross stepped out gingerly. She glanced at the unmoving baby. How is he? Still out. She grimaced. Mac's probably in the cottage. They strode toward the front door. The cottage appeared well kept. Definitely not abandoned. Almost made her think a woman's touch had made it look like this. Hey. Behind them, a voice called out. She turned around quickly, while Cross did so slowly, careful not to jar the animal. The woman who owned the voice was curvy, short, with short blonde hair and the clearest, most Caribbean blue eyes Ariadne had ever seen. Cross? Cross del Cruz? The curvy blonde's lips lifted into a smile. The blue eyes twinkled with delight. A pang of jealousy that she knew very well she had no right to feel struck at Ariadne. When did you get back, Cross? Back from where? Ariadne wanted to ask. I haven't been home long. Cross kept his volume level low. I have a patient for you. He may be in shock. I don't see any injuries. Then, as if remembering, Ariadne Fueller, meet Mac. Mackenzie Clarity. Mac. Only Mac. The blonde held her hand out, a smile still on her lips. Nice to meet you. Ariadne shook the hand of the immediately affable blonde. It was hard to not like her, even when she felt that twinge of jealousy. Mac took them to the large building and into a waiting room at the front. Let's go to the first exam room on the right, she told them. She opened a door. Ariadne had barely stepped a foot in the door when she had a change of heart. I'll wait out here if you don't mind. Ariadne couldn't go to the exam room, a tiny space with no windows. Anyone could come into the clinic, and she'd never know. She'd be trapped. She'd rather be in the waiting room, where windows would reveal anyone's approach. Being on the run sure had changed the way she viewed things. Not so very long ago, she'd never have thought of things like that. 20 minutes later, she was still waiting. A few minutes later, the door opened and Cross stepped out. Mac was behind him. No sign of the fawn. Ariadne found herself saying a little prayer he hadn't died. Is he okay? Buck's resting, Cross said. Buck? Ariadne looked at him, curious. Can't very well call him Bambi. Cross shrugged. Best I could come up with in a pinch. I'll keep the little guy, Buck, here. Mac was drying her hands off on a paper towel. Thanks, Mac. I'll come back in a few days to check on him. Maybe we can figure out a long-term plan for him. I know just the people who can help. I figured you did. A silence hung heavy in the air. Neither Mac nor Cross speaking. Ariadne looked from one to the other, wondering what the undercurrent was about. Mac nodded. Well? Yeah, Cross grunted. So how is he? Cross rubbed his jaw, the whiskers scratching audibly. He shrugged, wide shoulders rising then dropping with heaviness. Haven't really kept up with him. Mac nodded. Who the hell? Ariadne wondered. You? Cross asked. Me either. Mac chewed on her lip. The subject hung between them. I'm minding my own business. I have enough problems of my own. And yet, curiosity tugged at Ariadne's mind. She handed Cross his keys. Ready? Ariadne nodded.
Chapter 8. The trip had been quiet. Ariadne didn't offer much, and Cross wasn't in the mood to talk. Mac had caught him off guard when she'd asked about his brother Lance. She hadn't even had to say his name. Lance and Mackenzie had been together. Then one day they weren't. Lance wouldn't talk about it, and Cross never had a reason to visit Mackenzie, so he couldn't ask her about it. Thinking about Lance brought a measure of desolation to Cross's heart. 3 brothers, they'd grown up together in Mae's care, rather than be separated to different shifter homes. Mae, the one who always seemed to be taking orphans in. He glanced at Ariadne, noted her heart-shaped face reflected in the window she was staring out of. Her expression was pensive, her lips a somber line of uncertainty. What's your story? Everyone Mae took in had a story, whether shifter or human. Was she one of Mae's orphans? Seemed so now. The questions were burning to come out. But he didn't want to spook her. He'd find a way to ask later. Cross pulled into the shed. He'd passed Buck's mother on the road, and anger surged through him. He'd have to find out who the hell shot her. The locals didn't pull that shit. Not in Bear Canyon. And the deer were on his property, so at the very least, the bastard who did that had been trespassing. A growl of outrage and agreement came from his bear, catching Cross off guard. I didn't know you cared about the little one or his mother. His bear rumbled a response. He switched the ignition off and got out. Ariadne joined him. I'm going to bury his mother. He reached for a shovel hanging from the wall, then grabbed a tarp to wrap the doe's body. Do you think you could let me borrow your computer? Odd question. He wasn't sure he wanted to comply. There was no telling what she'd want to do with it. What if it were traced back to him somehow? Though he didn't really think that was very likely. He had enough precautions in place to make signals bounce all over the world and redirect anyone who tried to find his location. He didn't feel like discussing it right now, though. He'd talk about it with her when he returned. Sure. When I get back. That had tied her over until he returned. Then he'd find out what she wanted it for. He started walking with her down the path to the cabin to make sure she arrived safely. I can get there on my own. Why don't you take care of her? That way she doesn't have to be out all night. Cruz frowned. Why did it feel as though she was trying to get rid of him? I'm way too suspicious. He'd finished placing Buck's mother in the tarp, carefully wrapping it around her, and laying her in the hole he'd made in the middle of a patch of ground between several pine trees. With the back of the shovel, he patted the mound of dirt he'd put in over her body, smoothing it out. He'd put a stone marker for her there tomorrow. His phone buzzed against his leg. A text had come in. Taking out the phone, he swiped his password in. The message was from his security system. The same system that had alerted him there was an entry to his communications room earlier today indicated he had another intrusion. Entry Zone 1. Camera engaged and recording. Why had Ariadne entered his comm room? He told her he'd let her use a computer. He tapped on the screen so he could view what the camera was recording, and began to walk toward the cabin while he watched at his phone screen. Sure enough, it was Ariadne, holding something in her hand. She took a survey of the computers in the room, nervously running her fingers through her hair. He took long strides toward his cabin. Whatever she had in her other hand wasn't larger than her thumb. She approached one of his laptops and slipped the item into the USB drive. A flash drive. Except she wouldn't be able to log into the computer. She didn't have the password. He climbed the stairs on the front porch slowly, avoiding the creaky board he'd set up to alert him to intruders. He opened the front door slowly. She booted the system up. Cruz had a plan. She stared at the screen, requesting a password. Her frustration was evident as she closed the lid. He slammed the front door. She ran from the room. He studied the screen carefully, his shifter vision acute. The flash drive was still in his computer.
Chapter 9. Ariadne wiped the bead of sweat from her forehead. It wasn't even hot enough to perspire like this. Damn. 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 That was so close. Shit. 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 She'd left the fucking flash drive in the room. And now he was here. She was screwed. She'd have to wait until he fell asleep to get it. But what if he offered to let her use his computer? I can't have him going in there now. Time to use her feminine wiles. Feminine wiles? I'm doubly screwed. She so wasn't that super spy, feminine wiles kind of woman. She'd run into the restroom, and now walked out, hoping he'd buy that and not suspect her of being up to no good. God, I really didn't mean any harm. I need to send an email. She stepped out into the hallway. He was standing by the door, staring in her direction. Unexpectedly, at the sight of him, the air was slammed out of her lungs. He looked so forlorn it ripped her heart to shreds. Burying baby Buck's mother had not been an easy task for him. And I'm such a bitch for betraying his trust by going into his fancy computer room behind his back. She wasn't planning anything evil. She just needed to send that email. That was it. His dark eyes speared through her directly into her soul. There was a hunger in his eyes that called to the very being of her. It was as if a silent siren song called to her, bringing her dangerously close to him. Confused, she shook her head to break the trance of his gaze. She chewed on her lip, wishing he'd say something, yet unable to come up with something to say herself. This has to be sleep deprivation. Whatever is going on isn't real. But it was real. He walked slowly her way, his stride reminding her of a predator's. His broad chest rose with every deep breath, making muscles ripple. She was so aware of his body, she became unaware of anything else but the tunnel in which he was the very center. The hunger in his stare called to her, pulling her deeper and deeper. "It's done." He let the words out with the finality of a hammer. Tears of hopelessness for the fawn sprang to her eyes. He took a step closer, his body looming, blocking the light from the front living area. If she were honest with herself, it was more than the fawn. He took another step, that chest of his expanding with another breath. It was the lack of sleep. He took another step. It was fear. It was the lack of justice for her father's murder. He was almost close enough to touch. Mostly it was that she'd lost her father, her very best friend. Another step, and he was so close the warmth of his body emanated. A tear she couldn't hold back, one damned telltale betraying tear slipped out from the confines of her eyelashes and trailed its fugitive way down her cheek. She didn't even want to swipe at it, because she'd rather he didn't notice it.
Chapter 10. Cross saw the tear. Of course he did. Shifter vision allowed him to see in the dark. It gave him better vision than a bird of prey. But her tears weren't the only thing weighing on him. His bear's insistence that they fix what was troubling Ariadne was pulling at him. His inner animal kept pushing against him, harder and harder, insisting on a shift. That will scare the hell out of her. She doesn't know what we are. And yet the bear pushed, insisting if Cross wasn't going to find out what was on the flash drive, it would take action. He glanced at the door to the comm room, between the two of them. "I'll get to the bottom of this. Just back off for a bit," he told his bear. 3 strides later, he was in front of the door but still facing her. He reached for the knob, his gaze still locked with hers. "Don't," she whispered. He cocked his head. "Why not? Please. Will you tell me what you were going to do?" A long pause, so quiet, he could hear the drip of the faucet in the kitchen sink. He'd planned to fix that today. Before his plans were derailed. Drip. By a trapped fawn. Drip. By a woman in need. Drip. By a trip to the vet. Drip. By a grave he never should have had to dig. Drip. She chewed her bottom lip from a pale pink to a tormented red. "I was going to send an email." He turned the knob. "What email?" She gulped, her throat working. I can't say it." He pushed the door open a few inches. A sob escaped her, sounding as though it ripped from the very bowels of the deepest pain a woman could go through. He couldn't do it. Just couldn't. He pulled the door, closing it with a soft click. She was close enough to touch. And there was nothing else he could imagine doing. He held his arms out, uncaring that he probably smelled of sweat, dirt, and blood. She needed him. And deep down, where he didn't even want to admit it to his bear, he needed to hold her more than he'd ever needed anything. She crumpled into his embrace. Her body fit against his, as if she were made to be there. Every luscious part of her molded against him. He inhaled deeply, taking her scent into his lungs, letting it sit on his senses while his bear drew in her essence. She smelled like vanilla ice cream on a hot summer day by the lake. He and his bear processed and analyzed her scent. A faint telling of aroma spoke of attraction and desire. A part of Cross, especially his bear, rejoiced. Then they took in the other parts of her scent. Those were stronger, and they told of the fear she felt. There was something else there, sadness deep and desperate. What was on that flash drive? What could create these emotions? Ariadne. He pulled his head back, put his hand on her chin, and tilted her face upward. He trapped her gaze with his, making sure she understood he meant what he was going to say. You have to trust someone, sometime. Surely you should know if Fiona trusts Mae and Mae brought you to me, I'd mean you no harm. It's not our way to hurt anyone without cause. Her eyes dilated then contracted, the color molten jewels. She drew a deep breath in, held it, her body stiffening against his, until finally she exhaled slowly. Okay. In that one word, Cross picked up the cost of what she was giving up. She had no control, no security, nothing. She was giving it all to him. I'll be damned if I let her down. He already felt like he'd let Buck down. He should have heard shots, scouted for hunters something. Yet at the same time, he knew deep down, there was no way he'd have been able to anticipate what happened to Buck's mother. No, he wouldn't let Ariadne down. If it killed him, he'd keep from letting her down. I was going to email it while you were digging. I couldn't because the computer is password protected. He admired her for owning what she did. Let's do it now. My flash drive is in there already. She grimaced, making an I'm sorry face, and made as if to open the door, pulling away from his body. One thing. He held tightly. She paused. No more lies. Promise? She nodded. And you? Cross frowned. Me what? A bit more lip chewing. He used his thumb to pull her lip free of her even, pearly teeth. No lies. No lies, he affirmed, inwardly shaking his head at himself. How the hell will I manage that if she asks the wrong questions? His bear groused. Okay. Let's do this. Her stomach rumbled. Her eyes widened. She slapped her hands over her midriff. Sorry. Haven't eaten. Damn. He hadn't thought of eating. He'd been so caught up in the day. Let's feed you first. No. Ariadne put her hand on his arm. I may not be able to do it if I dwell on it much more. 5 minutes later, they were on the couch. He'd taken the flash drive out of the desktop, grabbed and booted up the laptop. While the processor did its thing, humming to life, he strode into the kitchen and grabbed a loaf of bread, cold cuts, and 2 bottled waters. He slapped a couple of sandwiches together and headed back. Leaning forward, elbows on knees, chin on knuckles, Ariadne was staring at the laptop on the coffee table, her face a mask of sadness. She glanced at Cross as he handed her the sandwich. She shook her head. I can't. My stomach's in knots. Whatever the hell she was going to show him, it had to be bad. She put the flash drive in the USB port. Cross sat next to her, his sandwich still on the plate. He didn't feel right eating if she didn't. The screen showed the open folder. He glanced at it. A video. You were going to email this? She nodded. Who were you sending it to? The Department of Justice. He did a double take. She was staring at the screen, her face in a motionless mask. He started the video. A man's face appeared on the screen. In his 50s, Cross figured. He was in a white shirt, unbuttoned, tie untied hanging loosely about his neck. Cross would have to guess he was a businessman after a day's work. The man smiled at the camera. From the graininess, Cross supposed it was a computer's web camera. Hey, sweetie. I realize I forgot to touch base with you last night. These out-of-town trips get crazy. Mr. Montez has been keeping me busy. Cross glanced at Ariadne. Her bottom lip was quivering. He focused on the screen, giving her privacy during what was surely a rough moment. It's not too bad here. I'll have to bring you to Chicago sometime. The man looked up from the camera's eye to something beyond and above the laptop. Ben. What are you doing here? How'd you get in? From off the screen a man's voice spoke. I do security. You don't think that door would keep me out, do you? What are you doing with that? The man in front of the camera said. His face had turned an ashen color. It's been brought to Mr. Montez's attention that you've been talking to the feds. No. Wait. The man raised his hands as if in surrender. Put that away, Ben. You can't do this. You're marrying my daughter, for God's sake. Off the camera's eye, the man called Ben scoffed. I won't have to with you gone. There's only so much I'll sacrifice for my mother's husband. Marrying your daughter shouldn't be something I should have to suffer through. Fuck. Cross had a bad feeling about this video. Ben, don't do this. Wait. A sound Cross knew only too well came next. A silence shot. And another. Crimson bloomed on the front of the man's shirt, spreading quickly. Then the man collapsed, his head close to the camera. The only thing visible was his hair, where it seemed to be touching the web camera's glass eye. A muffled sob came from Ariadne. Cross had never been good at emotions. He'd always held his in check, hidden them from the world, and didn't even acknowledge them to himself. He hadn't the foggiest clue how to help the attractive brunette next to him. He was pretty sure about one thing, though. That's your father. She sniffled and nodded. Fuck. Exactly what he'd been afraid of. Why was he talking to the feds? Who was that guy? Yeah, he had an idea who that guy was. She took a deep breath, rubbed her palms on her thighs for a lot longer than it would take to wipe sweat off. My fiancé shot my father. Ex-fiancé. Her voice was laced with poison. Not that he could blame her for that. And you're on the run. A nod. From your ex-fiancé. Another nod followed by, he works for the same man my father did. And I'm guessing these aren't good guys. Have you ever heard of Matthew Montez? He nodded. Anyone on the East Coast had. And he'd been recently assigned to that very area. That's who your father worked for? Yes. And so did my ex. Seems your dad was going to turn in evidence? Or testify. He never knew what he was getting into when he was hired years ago. He worked for another company that didn't have Mr. Montez's name on it. And when he found out, Cross prompted her. He was in too deep to just walk away. So he decided to become a witness for the prosecution. He was going to go into the protection program. He just told me 2 days before he went out of town. This was his last trip. He was going to get all the evidence he could, then we'd vanish. Something niggled at Cross. And your fiancé. Ex. I thought he loved me. Rage and a smidge of jealousy struck a chord in Cross's chest. That meant she thought she cared for him too. Unexpectedly, her face crumpled into an ugly cry. She made sloppy, wet sounds as she sucked air in. I told Ben we'd have to move. I didn't know. I had no way of knowing. More deep, slurpy breaths. Her ex turned her father in. Was it the ex's idea to let him kill her father? Or was that Montez's decision? So what was he supposed to say? How did it unfold? How did she find out? My dad and I always sent each other videograms. I found out he was dead and then saw this in my email. I couldn't watch it. He glanced at the timestamp on the video's file name. Not quite a month ago. And then one day you watched it. I thought I could handle it. I missed him. I needed to hear his last message to me. A torrent of tears streamed down her face. What a fucked up way to find out her fiancé killed her father. Then again, was there any good way to find that out? So, how do you get from seeing the video to being on the run? He had a feeling he knew the answer to that. She was a spitfire. I confronted him. Just as Cross had figured. He shut down the laptop. Ariadne didn't need to view that pain anymore. He tried to kill me. I got away from him. Hit him across the face with the fireplace poker. Left a huge gash. Had to leave town after that. But they have traces on my credit cards. My bank accounts are frozen. Ben's been on my trail. I'll never have peace. And Mae brought you here. That was all he could think of to say. Mae brought her here, not knowing her history or the danger she was in. Better Ariadne was with him than at the hair salon. There was no way Cross wanted to think of the women in Mae's shop having to deal with mob thugs. Someone would have to take out the ex-fiancé. Guess that someone is me. Not that Cross wasn't familiar with this line of work. It was what he was trained to do. But someone needed to get Montez under control, and it was unlikely Montez left the comfort of his New York home to chase down a girl who was a witness to something someone else did. I can't very well be in New York handling Montez while I'm trying to figure out where the ex-fiancée is. He glanced at the dark computer screen, the image of her father's murder fresh in his mind. I can help. Her thigh was pressed against his on the couch. The spot where their flesh touched, even though separated by fabric, felt like it was giving off sparks of electricity. He looked at their legs, marveling at the chemistry between them. He wondered if she felt the attraction, if her human side could appreciate how the bear in him had zeroed in on her as his mate. She reached for another paper towel and wiped her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed, bloodshot, and the gold in them vivid. Ariadne created frantic patterns on her thigh with her fingertips, drawing the same random shapes over and over. He put his hand on hers, more to calm her than anything, but the surge of energy that passed between their flesh seared his skin. Why the DOJ instead of the cops in New York, where Montez lives? That's where you were from, too. Too many of the cops are in Montez's back pocket. I can't trust them. She turned her eyes away from him, toward the window. Cross, she whispered, I don't trust anyone. You can trust me. She left her hand beneath his, leaning toward him, her body softening, relaxing. When was the last time you slept? Not more than an hour here and there, not since I saw the video. Damn. That explained the dark circles under her eyes. Why don't you get some rest? I've got some contacts. Let me reach out. Your contacts, do they have anything to do with the communication room you have in there? She indicated the hallway. He hesitated. No lies. You promised, she reminded him. And he knew it was important not to lie to her. I can't answer that. My work is confidential. She rolled her eyes. Hey. He tried for a light smile. At least I'm not lying. She nodded. Her sandwich was half-eaten, her eyes were heavy-lidded. A nap was due. I'll stand guard. I've got some calls to make. Why don't you take a short nap? I swear it. I won't go to sleep, and I won't do anything with the video. I won't send an email, I won't do anything. She leaned back, resting against his side. Cross monitored her breathing and pulse. When he was sure she was asleep, he dug his phone out of his pocket and called Mae. She picked up on the first ring. How is she? He glanced down at her. In repose, her face was almost angelic. Cupid bow lips, the bottom one much fuller. Her chest rose and fell with each deep breath. His body responded. His bear snarled. Goddamn. This isn't the time, he scolded his bear. She's resting. Guess she hasn't slept much in the last month. Has she told you anything? Because Fiona said she knew nothing about what was going on. Yeah. I got the story. Cross related the facts to Mae. Oh no. God no. She didn't witness that. Mae's tone was horrified. There was murmuring on her end while she recanted some details to Doc. Then she said, what can I do? Since you're still friends with Mikhail Romanov, I need you to get some help from him. Montez has to be taken out. She won't be allowed to live if he's not. What about her ex-fiancé? I'm heading out in the morning. I'll drop her off at your place if that's okay. Then I'll go find the bastard. Cross. He didn't like the tone in Mae's voice. I heard there was a large group of men with weapons that traveled through the valley. I was told they came in on the main highway and left the same way. Maybe she shook them or fooled them? Maybe they think she's passed through. Maybe. He'd never been that lucky. But perhaps Ariadne had been. He was tired of the bloodshed he dealt with during his time in the service. If he didn't have to kill again anytime soon, that would be fine with him. I've told Kane, Tanner, and Teague about the men that passed through. I'll give them a short briefing on the situation. I'll still bring her down tomorrow, maybe mid-morning, then go follow up on these passers through. Just to be sure. Probably not a bad idea. How are things with her? What do you mean, Aunt May? Damn, he knew exactly what she meant, though a part of him wasn't eager to accept it. He'd never believed in the shifter, fated mates thing. Ever. He'd never experienced it. Ever. She's the one for you. It's clear from the energy you two exude, and from the aura around you. Ah, come on with the witchery stuff. You don't believe it. You know very well that witchery exists. But I'm no witch. Just a very perceptive woman. Mae laughed. The problem, as Cross saw it, was Mae was never wrong when it came to mates. She'd always pegged others mates long before they'd known themselves. That was them. This is me. Cross knew when it came to himself, he didn't conform too well. He looked down at Ariadne. Her cheeks had a touch of color on them. She no longer had a corpse-like cast to her. He couldn't imagine her not being tucked in his arms like this. Always. His bear made a chuffing sound he'd never made before Cross met Ariadne. God damn it. Not you too. His bear grumbled a response, then settled into a watchful state, pulling Cross into slumber.
Chapter 11. Ariadne's eyes opened. A lamp nearby cast enough light to reveal her surroundings. She'd actually slept. For the first time in a long time. A rhythmic throb, strong and unyielding, reverberated in her mind, matching her pulse. It took her a second to realize the throb was coming from the man whose arms she was sleeping in. His heart beating strongly almost pulsed through her body. She'd have sworn their heartbeats were synchronized if she hadn't thought it was far too weird. His chest, so wide and full of muscles, was the perfect pillow. His face, that of a warrior, had settled into neutrality during sleep. She studied the planes of his cheekbones, the strong chiseled jawline with a pulse's tick beating against his skin. She thought of his scars. He was a warrior, but what kind? What kind of person had the setup like he had in his computer room? She snuggled in deeper. The feeling of safety overcoming everything else. She closed her eyes. Home. Slumber took over again.
Chapter 12. Cross woke up. The sun would be rising soon. His bear woke him up every day just before dawn. Of course, today would be no different. The warmth of Ariadne's body against his was too easy to get used to. Odd. Him. The one who'd never liked to cuddle. He should get up, make coffee, get breakfast, but it was far too comfortable here. The coffee table had shifted. He'd need to move it back before anyone found out his secret. He eyed the oversized low coffee table. The trapdoor beneath would lead to a tunnel. The tunnel, in turn, led to a multitude of tunnels. The tunnels predated Cross. Hell, they predated most everyone in Bear Canyon Valley. They'd been the project of Grant's grandfather. Native American. A grizzly shifter. He'd taken many steps to ensure the safety of the shifters in Bear Canyon Valley. Each on different mountain peaks, Cross's cabin and his brother's cabins all had tunnels beneath them. Before the three brothers had all joined the Shifter Council's compliance unit as enforcers, they'd each worked, together and separately, on their tunnels, making sure they were in good shape and adequately stocked for emergencies. He eyed the slim crevice peeking out at him from beneath the coffee table's leg. He'd moved the table over a little. He didn't need prying eyes. And at this stage, not even Ariadne's. She shifted slightly, nuzzling him with her forehead, tucking herself deeper into his embrace. He breathed in her serenity. It was lulling. Until he heard the sound. Pine needles and leaves crunching. Seems we aren't alone. He went on full alert, instantly. At the same instant, his phone vibrated on the seat next to him. Snatching it before it could wake her with its incessant, yet silent, vibrating buzz, he looked at the screen. A text. He wasn't familiar with the number, but knew instantly who it was from when he read the message. Buck slipped out of his enclosure and headed straight for the mountain. Well, fuck. That was a complication he didn't need. Poor Buck. He's probably trying to find his mother. Now he had a dilemma. Go hunt down the dirtbag who wanted to kill Ariadne, or find Buck. He'd take Ariadne down to safety in the valley. Find Buck. Deliver him to Mac. Then he'd hunt down the bastard ex-fiancé. He didn't realize he'd stirred until Ariadne lifted her head. First order of business, the crunching sound. Could be nothing. Then again, what if it was Buck? Or worse, Ariadne's ex. Though how would he have found this place? I'll be right back, he told her. Her eyes had that unfocused, dreamy look to them. Where you going? Heard something. Hang tight. He moved out from beneath her. What could it be? Maybe nothing. I'll be right back. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. An explosion sounded, making his ears ring. The room lit up as if countless flashbulbs had gone off. Stun grenade. Get down, Cross shouted at Ariadne, pushing her toward the wood floor between the coffee table and the couch. He covered her with his body. He found me. Her voice was low but held a steely resolve, coupled with desperation. It won't end until he kills me. Or I kill him first. Cross sprinted for the side door, not willing to go out the front. It was the window by the front door they'd sent the grenade through. Slipping out, it didn't take him long to get his bearings. The area was teeming with men. The wind carried the scent of maybe a half dozen, camo-ed and hiding. Perhaps a few more, spread out farther back. His shifter hearing picked them up in the trees. He made a cloud of dust beneath his feet as he took off for the trees, then used them to cover him as he circled around to the front door. His mind raced, trying to process the scene. They were heading his way. As an enforcer, Cross kept his shifting skills at the ready. Not to say it was painless, because damn it would never be painless. The process of turning his 6-foot, 4-inch body from a human to a massive grizzly could only be described as excruciating. He'd need to be his bear to complete the plan that was semi-formed in his mind. His solitary goal was to protect Ariadne. At all costs. He gave in to his grizzly's push and braced himself for the beast's rush to transformation. A massive pulsing began deep within his body. The bear's heart, large and powerful, collided into Cross's torso. His ribcage cracked, making his body arch. A searing pain in his face preceded the widening and lengthening of his jaw. Grizzly canines erupted in an agonizing burst. A snarl ripped from Cross's throat, sounding more like a bear already. His career made shifting quickly imperative, and Cross was damned good at bringing his bear into existence. Seconds later, he raised a mighty bear head, sniffed, and catapulted himself toward the aggressors. Shit. One man's voice came from behind the trees. It's a goddamn bear. A pop sounded, barely loud enough for human ears to pick up. A stinging sensation in Cross's shoulder told him he'd been shot. The popping sound. Cross put that together immediately. The bastards were using silencers. Definitely not your average thugs. These guys had been sent to kill Ariadne. They were sent to kill her. A man stepped out from behind a nearby tree, firearm raised. He pulled the trigger. The shot stung Cross, but he didn't lose his momentum. He charged the man, took one razor-sharp swipe at the thug's vulnerably exposed throat, and severed his jugular. Another popping sound. Bark flew, wood chips scattering. Whoever shot at his bear had missed. Within seconds that thug was dead as well, a quick and bloody mess left behind as Cross scoured the trees for his next target. Another explosion came from the house. Another stun grenade. Worse. Were they going to storm the cabin? Find her. He had to get to Ariadne. There was no way he could protect her from this much firepower. He'd have to shift. To say that it drained a shifter to morph was an understatement. Some shifters could shift twice in a period of an hour. An adept shifter could do it 3 times, but the average shifter couldn't handle more than one. Thankfully, Cross had never been called on to shift 3 times in rapid succession. He shifted into his human body. His clothes shifted with him, as they always did with his kind, except, instead of simply being the usual amount of rumpled, he now had 2 bullet holes surrounded by crimson rings. Luckily, he'd been in his bear form when he was shot. It wouldn't have been so easy to walk away if he'd been in his human body. He gauged the best way to get to Ariadne and headed toward the side window, careful not to be noticed. It wasn't long before he was inside. He chanced to glance out the window. Men were approaching. The thugs were being cautious, which was a lot better than having them rush the cabin. Ariadne was still on the floor, exactly where he'd left her. Except she was unconscious. Well, fuck. He checked her. She had a pulse. Time to get her the hell out of here. He adjusted the coffee table quickly, making sure it covered the seam. He really should nail the damn thing in place. He'd never seen a reason to before. No one visited his cabin. He sure as hell saw a reason now. Table in place, he reached behind the couch and pressed a button disguised as a knot in the rustic wood wall. The soft sound of a motor churning to life followed, and the coffee table rose, as if levitating, brought up by the system Cross had installed right after he'd acquired the land more than a decade ago. The table shifted to the right, allowing access to the stairway leading to the tunnel system. Hefting Ariadne into a fireman's carry, wasting not a second, Cross entered the dark hallway. They'd never installed lighting. Shifters didn't need it, since they saw in the dark as well as they did in the light. Once he'd gone far enough on the staircase, he pressed a button on the stone wall, making the coffee table return to its place and sealing the tunnel off from the rest of the world. To be extra sure, he then disabled the motor, so no one could accidentally enter from above. Taking 1 second to heave a sigh of relief, he glanced down at Ariadne. He felt for her pulse, just to be sure. Strong. That was when he saw the laceration on her temple. Must have happened after the second grenade. He leaned in to kiss next to the cut. His bear took over. Cross's mouth touched the laceration. The bit of blood alit on his lip. His tongue flicked, tasting it, absorbing her life's flow. A current traveled through his body. You were not supposed to do that. He was furious with his bear. He'd bound them together. Not the same as a couple bond, not nearly the same, but his bear had connected Cross and Ariadne as if a silken tie held their souls together. They'd feel one another. Forever. She better want me like I want her. Like you want her. His bear growled in Cross's head. You better hope she does. Or we're going to feel her, and she's going to feel us wherever we are. You knew better. You know that is not to be taken lightly. Cross's heart beat in synchronicity to Ariadne's, hers throbbing in his mind, in his body. He pushed away his concerns. He had a plan to follow through with. Cross traversed the unlit tunnels that were more like corridors after years of maintenance and care. A few moments later, he arrived in the bunker he'd set up for the occasion. One hopes will never make him need it. He placed her on a cot, grabbed a bottled water from the stash and a washcloth from the basin and rinsed the blood away. She gasped and frantically began to writhe. A scream came from her throat. Ariadne. Stop. It's me. Cross. She stilled. It's so dark. I didn't know. Wait. Let me get you some light. He grabbed the hurricane lamp from the corner, lit it with the matches nearby, and adjusted the flame. How did you do that? See the lamp in the dark. What did you mean when you said you'd get me some light? Fuck. Great. And he'd said no lies. He'd promised her. And for some reason, this promise he made to her was as serious as an oath for him. She frowned in the dimness, waiting for his response. And while she waited, she studied the room.
Chapter 13. Ariadne's head was throbbing. An oceanic wave seemed to be ebbing and flowing in her head. She heard a pounding, loud, like heartbeats, but couldn't understand where it was coming from. She'd been next to the coffee table, lying there as Cross had instructed. Then she'd been getting up, against Cross's warning to stay down, when another explosion had rocked the cabin and sent her down. She remembered getting hit in the head, but didn't know what hit her. Ariadne glanced around the dimly lit room. No windows, walls that resembled a cave's walls. The room had sparse furniture in it. A table, 3 chairs. Why 3? Then she realized he wasn't answering her. His eyes were drilling into her, as if he were looking for something. Well? She prompted him. I promised I wouldn't lie. He placed the damp washcloth on the table, but his gaze was glued on hers. So you won't answer? I can't. Not good enough. Not by a long shot. I feel so weird. Where are we? In a bunker. That was all he had to say. This was like pulling teeth. Did he not wonder what kind of weird she felt? Or why? Where's this bunker? Where are the guys that threw the grenade? It was Ben and his guys, right? Under my cabin. Up in the cabin. And it seemed so. Now she'd brought danger to him. You've got blood. You were shot? What did she miss while she was unconscious? It's nothing. Flesh wounds? Didn't look like nothing, from the amount of red on his shirt. I didn't mean to bring you into this. God. We need to call the cops. She couldn't breathe. It felt as though she reached for the cot side, squeezing. Fine time for a panic attack. Yeah, as if I can control them. As if panic attacks strike when it's convenient. Ariadne. Breathe. He grasped her shoulders. Relax. You have to. We can't call law enforcement. Why? She gasped for air. Why not? You ask too many questions. His brows drew downward. You give too few answers. You're one to speak. He paced the floor. If you trust me. Of course I trust you. How could he even ask her that? After seeing his bloody clothing, after all the risks, how could she not trust him? Though if she were to admit it, she trusted him before this. There was something about this man, a connection she couldn't explain though she felt it deeply. Then you'll stay right here. Do nothing. Go nowhere, no matter what you think you hear. They can't find you in here. This place is not easily accessed unless you've been shown how. There's plenty of food here. He pointed to freestanding pantry shelves in the corner. And water. Facilities are to the right, just outside this room. I'm not. You will. His tone brooked no argument. But? Cross stopped his pacing and approached her. His face was streaked with dust, his expression grim. He ensnared her with both hands on her hips, pulled her closer. Do you feel it? She couldn't lie. She nodded. He leaned forward, dipped his head, his lips alit on hers softly, then he took a long pull of her lips, his tongue claiming hers. Ariadne had never felt this before. The surge of energy between them swept her into a wind tunnel where only the two of them existed. The two of them. And this kiss. He claimed her mouth with a primal need that matched her own passion. Something deep within her connected with him, drew closer to him, melded with his soul. When he pulled away, she was breathless, the good kind of breathless, nothing like a panic attack. This right here is why you need to stay put. We have something. I can't have your mortality putting me in a position where I have to spend an eternity without you. She had no clue what he meant. His words sounded like poetry, almost, except Cross didn't seem to be like a poet, not in the least. Not this rough-and-tumble mountain man. She touched her swollen lips, her skin chafed deliciously from the scruff of his days-old beard. She believed in what he was saying, even if she didn't understand it. There was something between them, finer and less tangible than a spider's web, and yet stronger than the strongest substance she could fathom. I'll be here. And when I get back, I have things to tell you. He held her chin, his eyes locked to hers. In the dark depths, an amber glow flared. Things you won't believe. But you have to know the truth if you'll be mine. All of the truth. The only words that mattered to Ariadne were, "if you'll be mine." Suddenly, she could picture a life. Not a little house on the prairie sort of life, but one filled with adventure, love, trust. How can this be? I just met him. She couldn't answer. It simply was.
Chapter 14. Reassured Ariadne wouldn't be leaving the bunker, and ready to end the threat to her life, Cross made his way through the tunnels. He'd go to the opening 50 yards to the east and come out. He'd sneak up on them and take them out one at a time. Yeah, not a very fancy plan, but what options did he have? Light shone through the tiny opening, indicating he'd reached the end of the tunnel systems at the northwest entrance. All told, there were 20 entrances scattered around the mountain. Some were disguised as caves, some were hidden behind waterfalls, others were tucked into tree trunks. Grant's grandfather hadn't left anything to chance. He listened at the exit before parting the vines in the old tree's trunk. The tunnel's entrance had been dug and carved out of the ancient tree's body. Just above it, before he exited, he saw the symbol. It was over every tunnel entrance, a prayer of protection. This was what Cross had been told, long ago when he was a teen. Long before he'd taken the steps to secure this property as his own, he'd felt the power of that prayer. The older shifter who'd given him the tour of the mountain had told Cross he had a connection to the land. A teenage Cross had tried to blow the man off, pretending his words didn't matter, though deep down, the idea of having a connection appealed to the orphan. Cross had never told Mae about the shifter. He'd wondered if she knew, but after the older man asked Cross to keep his presence a secret, Cross couldn't say no. Not when the man had taught him about the mountain. The man had told him to call him Grizz. No name. Just Grizz. A scar crossed his face, starting above his eyebrow, then extending down over his cheekbone and almost to his jawline. It was as if a blade or a bear's claw had slashed downward. Cross had never asked, though God knew he'd always wanted to. The thing about Grizz, he always seemed to be around during Cross's most difficult times. Cross shook his head to push the memories of Grizz aside. He needed to concentrate on the task at hand, not get lost in memories of the past. He hadn't seen Grizz since he'd left for the compliance unit. Making his way across, toward the barrage of men he knew awaited him, he kept low, stayed hidden by the trees. Finally, he found them. Waiting, gathered in loose circles. He counted 10 men. Fuck. All armed. I may live a hell of a long time, but I don't know that I can take that kind of firepower. What the hell were they doing? What were they waiting for? His answer came quickly. How much longer, Ben? This came from one of the men. How many times do I have to tell you? Until Cliff gets here. Mr. Montez said to wait for Cliff. Cross studied the man who'd answered. He'd heard that voice before. The voice on the video with Ariadne's father. Ben. Ariadne's ex-fiancé. Murderer. Dirtbag. He squinted, studying the man who'd killed her father. He was big. He looked like a thug wannabe. Yeah, he wants Cliff here because you screwed up, letting her live, a different guy said. Ben cocked his arm and slapped the man with a pistol. Shut your fucking mouth. The man fell backward, holding his mouth, blood seeping between fingertips. Did you tell him how to get here? A fourth guy asked. A murmur of impatience rippled among the men. He can track her just like we did. Ben's voice was dangerously arrogant. Track her? Fuck. Ariadne was still in danger. If they figured out about the tunnels. Fear ate Cross's stomach raw. She wasn't safe. Not as long as whatever they were using to track her was around. How could they be? He tried to think of what? Her clothing? Her purse? Shoes? His mind went to that locket she occasionally touched. Clearly precious to her. The bastard probably put something in the locket. He should get back to her. Get her changed, get rid of all her belongings, take her down to Mae's, then come back up here and kick some ass. He'd have to get to his truck. Somehow, his bear roared in his head, wanting to shift and kill the man immediately in the bloodiest, most painful way possible. His bear wanted to kill all of them for coming after her. Not yet. We should make sure she's safe. As long as she's being tracked, she's in danger. His bear bellowed in protest. No. This isn't the time. We need to take care of her. The bear insisted the best way to take care of her was to take him out. Take out the head of the snake, then the body follows. Times like this, he wished he still had some of his men. His small squad of 6 shifters was deadly, but they were absent. Tough call. Kill the bastard, protect the girl. Their argument didn't last long. A tiny cracking sound came from the trees to the left of the thugs. Cross's head snapped in the direction of the sound. He made out a tiny form, wobbling and weaving between the trees. It didn't take long to recognize the tiny creature. Baby buck. Jesus, the little one had found its way home. Cross didn't dwell on the fact he'd just thought of his home as the little deer's home. There's that little deer. You missed him last time. He's startled when I shot the mama. Ben's voice. Ben. The bastard shot Buck's mother? Get the little critter now, the other guy said. That sealed Cross's plan of action. He jumped forward, his speed supernatural thanks to his shifter skills, and stood between the little deer and the thugs. He didn't have long to think on that one. A round ripped through the flesh of his shoulder, then another ripped into his bicep. He took the third round in the thigh. Cross dropped to the ground, covering the little deer with his body. They were half hidden by a group of bushes and undergrowth. Who the hell? One of the men yelled. That's the one helping Ariadne. Where the hell did he come from? Who knows? Well, he's out of the picture now. Yeah, he is, one said with a chuckle. Buck was still beneath Cross, but he could feel the baby deer's heartbeat. Strong, not steady, because clearly the little one was scared. But strong. Cross lay still, inhaling. He picked up the scent of his own blood. But he didn't pick up Buck's scent. He raised a prayer of thanks that he'd pulled the fawn out of this unscathed. So far. He still needed to get the deer to freedom. And Ariadne to safety. Cross felt his body weakening. He was losing blood. His pulse was getting weaker. He'd have to shift to heal fast enough to staunch the outflow of blood. His bear pushed on Cross, insisting on a shift. It was a matter of self-preservation for the bear now. His bear knew if Cross couldn't live, the bear couldn't, not if they reached the point of no return. His grizzly roared for release. Cross was ready to give control to the bear. Let's wreak some havoc on these motherfuckers. He prayed the little deer wouldn't have a heart attack from finding himself beneath a grizzly. Should we check on him? Nah. No one could live through that. He heard them speaking, even amid the sounds of his bones crunching and grinding, tendons expanding. He rose slowly, letting the little deer up. The deer sniffed at Cross's bear, then nuzzled his leg. He knows me. Even in my bear, he knows me. Cross grumbled softly at Buck. Get the hell out of here, little fella. I'm gonna rain some hell on the bastards that killed your mama. Man, that hit close to home for Cross. Thinking of losing his parents, seeing little Buck an orphan. Anger coursed through him, driving the adrenaline through his bear with a ferocity that had never been matched in passion to the jobs he'd done as an enforcer. Those were jobs. This was personal. As if he got it, as if he knew what Cross wanted him to do, the little deer sprinted behind the trees. Standing in the shadows of tall brush, he watched Cross's bear with alert eyes. Cross bellowed. He released his wrath and his frustration with a roar. Rearing up on his hind legs, letting the men see the full extent of his height, the measure of lethal danger he could yield, Cross charged them. He took round after round from each man, plowing through them, mowing them down like unwanted weeds. Cross was bleeding from more bullet hole wounds than he could count, but he kept charging, mauling, lunging, fighting. Until one pulled out an AK. Fuck. Things weren't going to be as easy as he'd thought. The first few rounds pierced his hide, and yet Cross kept going. But the last few shots did him in. He catapulted into a headfirst fall, rolled, and collapsed, his eyes looking to the sky that old Grizz had told him was the place he'd see him again one day. Then he heard the growls. The sound of roaring, followed by screaming. A shadowy form flew over him, large black and white stripes merging in thick fur. He turned his head, his vision blurry. Brown fur, black fur, white and dark stripes. A flurry of movement as his eyes closed. Chapter 15. Pain. All over. Fuck. The worst pain Cross had ever felt. He wanted to reach for the spots that stung, but there were too many of them. Cross opened his eyes. The last thing he remembered was being in his bear. Cross was now in his human body. He raised his head. God, that hurt. He lay in the clearing. The area was littered with bodies, all of them the thugs who were trying to kill Ariadne. He was surrounded by 4 bears and a white tiger. What the fuck? If he could have shaken his head to clear his mind and see things straighter, he would have, but the effort it took to raise it was bad enough. Cross narrowed his eyes, squinting at the vision before him. Indeed, 4 bears and yeah, a white tiger. The tiger turned his brilliant gaze toward Cross. A few seconds, and with a minimum of bone crunching and sinew stretching sounds, the white tiger had morphed into a dark-haired man. The bears followed suit, also shifting. The tiger shifter looked at Cross, running an appraising gaze over him, then turned toward the grizzly shifters. How come every time I come back to the valley, I have to save a bear's ass? His striking face had a smile on it. I'm Vittorio Tiero. You can call me Vax. Hey now. This came from Kane, one of the grizzly shifters, the mate of Doc's stepdaughter Astra. You're in the valley, showing off your son. And don't go pretending like you weren't interested in a little bit of action. You're right. Vax laughed. Kane, Doc, and the 2 grizzly shifter brothers, Teague and Tanner, joined in. Seriously, Doc said. He needs to shift and heal. I don't think he'll make it if he stays in his human body. Glad Mae insisted we come up here. Agreed, Tanner and Teague said simultaneously. He felt arms lifting him onto a stretcher. His body was levitating. No, they were picking him up. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he was in his cabin, in his bed. His breathing was labored. His mind muddled. Grizz kept appearing to him, telling him he needed to live, smacking him in the back of the head, jarring him from the deepest slumber Cross knew awaited him. Why is Grizz doing that? Wait. Cross winced from the effort of talking, looking for Doc. Ariadne. She's. The shifters leaned closer. His strength was waning. Cross took a deep breath, flinching from the gurgling sound that came from his lungs. In my bunker. Got it. Doc put his hand on Cross. Shift now, friend, else you'll regret it. Shift. Cross heaved another breath, the bubbling sound louder. Then Doc said, Grant will know exactly where. His grandfather helped build the tunnels.
Chapter 16. Ariadne heard the gunshots above ground. Not even being deep under the earth could have disguised those sounds. And she knew exactly what that meant. Cross didn't have that kind of firepower. He wasn't the one shooting. Not that amount of shooting. That was the result of several men with weapons. That could only mean one thing. A crushing sensation, worse than the fist of a titan, seized her heart, squeezing it, relentlessly stealing her life away. Stealing her hope away. Everything gone. Cross, she could feel his heartbeat growing weaker. She would have sworn to it, though how could that be? She barely knew this man. How can I feel this? Wherever Cross was, she could feel him growing weaker, going to a dark, deep place. No. No. And then he was gone. She couldn't feel him anymore. I've lost my mind. No, she was sure she hadn't. There was a connection to Cross. She didn't know how or when it had happened, but it was there. She felt him. She could feel him. And now he was gone. There was a void in a place she hadn't known existed. Ariadne tucked her legs against her body, leaned against the cold wall, rested her chin on her knees, and cried. She cried like she'd never cried before, except for when she saw the video of Ben betraying her father. Ariadne had no idea how much time had passed. Without windows or a way to keep time, all she could figure out was that the tears had dried. Her face was swollen, she could feel the skin taut, stretching, puffy from crying. She was dehydrated, but had no will to drink. The lantern had gone out. She had no will to light it. Why should she? So she could make Ben's job of finding and killing her easier? No. She'd not make that bastard's job any easier. She'd seen a pipe in the corner that would make a good weapon. Feeling her way in the dark, Ariadne slowly made her way across the rustic floor. Damn. She'd stubbed her toe on something. She felt the smoothness of the wood with her fingertips. It was the cupboard. Going around it, her fingers alit on the cool, smooth pipe. She hefted the heavy pipe, more than 3 foot long, between her hands and felt her way across the room back to her cot. She slipped into place, assuming the same position, except this time she had the pipe with her. Ben would pay. Ariadne heard them. The soft footfalls, the murmuring. Then she could sense their presence in the room with her. Definitely more than one man, judging from the rustling of their clothing. They were almost on her. She could almost feel the warmth of their breaths, she was sure. Though a part of her said it was ludicrous, she'd feel that. Taking the pipe in hand, she slowly raised it, leaning back, bracing herself for the impact. Ben would be first in line. He couldn't stand the idea of not getting the credit for any task. What did I ever see in him? No time to deal with that now. She wanted Ben's brains splattered on Cross's bunker. A fitting end to this story. Then his men could shoot her. At least she'd have vengeance. She swung the pipe, it sailed through the air with a whoosh, while she anticipated the moment it would connect. It didn't. It went all the way around, full circle. The momentum threw her sideways onto the cot, the pipe slamming into the stone wall. She'd missed. Fury escaped her in the sound of a cry, halfway between a yell and a sob. Her hand stung from holding the pipe while it struck solid wall. She ignored the pain and picked up the weapon, ready for another try. Ariadne. That wasn't Ben's voice. She'd heard that voice before. 2 seconds it took her to remember it. Doc? Yes? His voice was a comfort in the darkness. Please put the pipe down. She lowered the metal rod. The sound of a match, then the lamp was lit. How had he known she'd held a pipe in the darkness? How had he found the lamp without any light to see it? Doc's face was grim in the flickering light. Behind him, Grant Waters was silent. Her questions now forgotten, she could only express her confusion about how they'd found her and what had happened. Well, where, how? He's no longer a threat. Your ex-fiancé. All his men. Gone. You're safe. Adrenaline still pumping, her heart still racing, air escaped her lungs with a loud exhale. She may not be in danger from Ben, but Cross was gone. Cross, she whispered his name. He was hurt. I felt it. You felt it? Grant asked her, but looked at Doc. It's crazy. How could she begin to explain it? Doc examined her head. You may have a concussion. That would explain what had happened. She'd hallucinated. But she wasn't totally wrong. They did say Cross was hurt. Can I see Cross? His body is in no condition for you to see it now. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. She knew it. He had been killed. That was why she'd felt him leave his body. Let's get you to Mae's. Chapter 17. 2 days later. Ariadne lay in the guest bedroom at Mae's for what seemed like forever. Doc had suggested she stay in bed until he said otherwise. So she did. On the second day, she'd asked about Ben. Asked about leaving. Soon Mae said, "Ben and his men are gone." "By gone you mean?" Ariadne couldn't finish her sentence. "They have all been buried. The threat to you is gone." "But Mr. Montez." Ariadne knew, just because Ben might be out of the picture, didn't mean Mr. Montez wouldn't seek for her silence to be permanent. "He's..." Mae looked at Doc, then back at Ariadne. "Mr. Montez met with an..." Mae chewed on her lip, "an unfortunate accident." Ariadne narrowed her eyes. She recalled, long ago, Fiona had told her Mae seemed deceptively simple, living in Bear Canyon Valley, running her hair salon. That she had powerful connections. She cocked her head, studying the attractive brunette. Did she have something to do with Mr. Montez's accident? She didn't want to ask. Each hour merged into the next hour, each hour was the same. Mae and Doc, talking in the kitchen, worried about her. People visiting. Mae talking to them, about Ariadne. Them. Lots of them. Seems tons of Mae's friends had come by. Chelsea and Grant Waters had visited the most. A man named Vax and his wife Callie had come by with their baby boy. A cute little tyke, wrapped in blankets, writhing to get out of his mother's arms. Seeing the baby brought tears to Ariadne, but she'd hidden them, containing her emotions until she was alone. Minute after minute, she'd wondered when they were going to bury Cross. Would it be out of line for her to attend his funeral? She didn't have the nerve to ask. No one will understand. Of that she was convinced. How could they get the connection she had to Cross? She didn't even get it. A few more friends stopped by, Tanner, Marty and their little boy Dominic. Joe, Sarah and their little boy Ivan. Tanner's brother Teague and a very pregnant Kelsey. Doc's stepdaughter Astra, a beauty with glowing light green eyes, and her man Kane. Their faces and names were all blending together. The only thing that stuck with Ariadne was that they were happy. How could they be so happy when one of their friends had died? How did they not hate her? She was the reason he was gone. All these people, these couples, all of them happy. And then there's me. Her. Alone. On the night of the third day, after what felt like an eternity, Doc proclaimed she was well enough to drive and do whatever else she wanted to do. The next day was a beautiful early spring day. Crisp, sure, but the sun was shining, as if the day held promise. As if the day held hope. Ariadne grimaced at the thought of hope, and put her empty coffee cup in the sink. Mae had gone to the salon. The house was empty. Ariadne was roaming around, feeling like a ghost haunting a building but not really belonging. She knew exactly what she had to do. She grabbed her jacket and her keys from the hook by the back door. The drive up the mountain was almost like a mockery of her emotions. The sun's brilliance highlighted the beauty of promise and wonderful things to come. Bloom was just a breath away. For everything but Cross. No Cross. No hope. No life. She wiped a traitorous tear from her cheek. Sometime later she pulled up in front of Cross's shed. She'd walk the rest of the way there. Ariadne didn't get out right away. She sat in the car, preparing herself for this final goodbye. Then she'd head down the mountain, thank Mae and anyone else she saw, then she'd go. Somewhere. Anywhere. It's not like it matters where. She opened the car door, closed it softly behind her, and began the short trek toward his cabin. She thought she'd cry. She thought she'd have a series of emotions flying through her. She didn't. Ariadne was numb. Without warning, tiny footfalls like hers but lighter and more of them in number came from behind her. God. Now what? She whirled around. Buck? With dark, liquid brown eyes, the little deer studied her. How'd you get out here? She squatted down, hoping the little one would remember her, though why would he? Was he here mourning too? Silly me. As if he would have a bond with Cross. As if a deer mourns. Wait, maybe he's here looking for his mom? Or maybe he's... Buck nudged her with a cool black nose against her cheek. She chuckled and raised her hands. When Buck didn't flinch or move, she wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in the thick fur. "I miss him too," she whispered close to the deer's long ear. Buck nuzzled her ear, his warm breath tickling. "You can't live out here alone. You'll die. Whoever shot your mom could kill you." She could always go get Mac, or try to take Buck to Mac. But first order of business, she wanted to go to Cross's cabin. "Want to go with me?" She rose and resumed her walk. Buck stayed right by her side. As they reached the clearing that held his cabin, she noticed a truck. "Why is Doc here?" She felt like an interloper. She didn't want to intrude on whatever Doc was doing here, but she couldn't leave without going inside, sitting on the couch. She'd had a thought. She wasn't sure if she wanted to follow through with it, but she wanted to find the flash drive too. Just in case. She could give it to Mae as leverage, in case Montez hadn't really been taken care of and had simply gone into hiding. A ragged sigh chewed its way through her chest. The air was just chilly enough to leave a puffy cloud of her breath. It was much cooler here than it had been down in the valley. She climbed the steps, her heart heavy. Buck stayed off the porch, standing by the stairs, his gaze attentive. "Hopefully Doc doesn't mind my coming in." She opened the front door. No sign of Doc. Maybe she should find him, before she went poking around for the flash drive. She approached the only door she hadn't been opened before, since there wasn't really anywhere else Doc could be if he was in the cabin. Though that was probably Cross's bedroom. Ariadne took a deep breath, turned the knob, and opened the door. Doc flew to his feet. He'd been sitting by the bed, a crossword puzzle in one hand, a pen in the other. "Ariadne." His voice was low. "What are you doing here?" He glanced at the bed. Ariadne followed his gaze. At first, she thought it was a bearskin rug. Except, rugs were supposed to be flat. Rugs didn't breathe. Rugs didn't make low rumbling sounds. Ariadne jumped back. She shook her head. "This can't be happening." "Doc?" Her voice cracked. "It's okay." "It's?" His voice trailed off. Ariadne shook her head. This big-ass bear was going to kill them, and he was saying it was okay. She couldn't run out and slam the door. Doc would be left behind. Wait. Wait just a moment. Why is he sitting here in a room, doing a crossword puzzle, while there's a bear next to him on Cross's ginormous bed? A series of crunching sounds, then tearing sounds. Then, in a scene that matched something she'd only expect to see in a movie, the bear transformed. Before her lay Cross. In the same clothing he'd been wearing the last time she saw him. Covered in bullet holes. And dried blood. Cross sat up. The world turned dark.
Chapter 18. Cross groaned. Ariadne's eyes rolled to the back of her head. She dropped to the floor before Doc or Cross could get to her. Cross leapt from the bed, ignoring the aftereffects of the hibernation, pushing the weakness of expending so much energy to heal his body. Jesus. He shook his head. He'd been in a hibernating heel, essentially like a bear-induced coma, while his body recuperated from the rounds he'd taken. You seem to be recovered. Doc joined him on the floor, checking on Ariadne. She got a nasty bump on her head, said she couldn't remember how. Yeah, that was while she was in the cabin. The events flashed through Cross's mind. The second explosion. Hiding her in the bunker. Tasting her blood. Damn his bear. Doc was watching his face. Is it what I think it is? We didn't couple bond, if that's what you're asking. Yeah, but something happened. Cross nodded. I thought I saw that in her eyes. She's connected to you. She's been thinking you were dead. I could see it. But I couldn't ease her mind by telling her the truth. Guess she knows it now. Cross shook his head. She would hate him. She'd run away as fast as she could now that she knew the truth about him, about his bear. I know what you're thinking. You need to stop that. She's stronger than you realize. And her bond to you is stronger than you know. I saw the pull between the two of you the first time I met her. Mae saw it too. Cross scratched his jaw. His beard had gotten thicker and scruffier than he could tolerate it. She'll hate me. Cross. Ariadne. You need to talk to her. Doc rose to his feet. I'm going to go check on Mae. Call if you need anything. Cross nodded and Doc slipped out the door. Cross had healed fine. He didn't need Doc to keep watch over him. And he had some talking to do with Ariadne. He took a deep breath. Yeah, he had a lot of talking to do with her. Hey. He leaned close, his eyes taking in her face. He dreamt about her during hibernation. He'd felt her sadness, felt her desolation, but there was nothing he could do. His bear wouldn't let him come out of the deep sleep. It knew it would kill both of them. He drank in her face, noticing her paleness. Damn, her face looked gaunt. Her golden green eyes had lost their luster. You're alive. Her gaze locked on his face. I thought you. I know. I'm sorry you had to go through that. You knew? That I thought you were dead. Her eyes grew wide. How did you know? Oh man. He knew what he should do. Send her away. Tell her a lie. Being a shifter's mate wasn't always what it should be. The danger of territorial wars, old grudges, new enemies. Compound that with his job. This would never work. She frowned, waiting for his response. Fuck it. He wasn't about to let go of Ariadne. No way. No how. He pushed away a loose lock of hair from her forehead, studying the spot where she'd hit her head. Still not fully healed, of course, because she wasn't a shifter. If he bonded with her, she'd heal faster. But did she want that? Did she want to be his? He vacillated, back and forth, back and forth. Be honest. Lie. Tell her what you are. Don't tell her shit. Over and over, he won and lost the battle to reveal himself to her fully. Cross. He clenched his jaw. He had to give her the choice. Yeah. He squared his shoulders. Telling you the truth could mean losing you. Never. She'd said never, but she had no idea, did she? Ariadne lifted herself upward, moved slightly, leaned against the wall next to him. She laced her fingers in his. I never thought I could trust someone the way I trust you. Her voice was husky. He realized that was because of the emotions. She had to be thinking of her father and the betrayal at Ben's hands. I know you'll never do anything to hurt me, Cross. I know it. And remember your promise, no lies. I think you know the worst there is to know. You saw my bear. She nodded, then leaned her head against his arm. I did. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but after that day, when you took me to the bunker, things changed. I felt like there was this invisible bond between us. There was. I created a bond when I took your essence in me. She looked confused. Your blood. From the cut on your temple. Wait. Hang on. She stood up and began to pace the room. His gaze followed her silhouette as she made loose circles in front of the bed. Her hips moved temptingly, her breasts swayed, her curves tantalized him with every step. Cross felt a stirring in his pants. With each step Ariadne took, the stirring grew stronger, deeper. She paused, chewed her lip, then began the pacing again. I get that I saw the bear. And I haven't even wrapped my head around that yet. I know I should be freaked out. Why am I not? Because, when I took a part of you in me, it opened up my soul to yours. Deep down, what I am couldn't shock you because you knew already. Though it's not quite as strong as a couple bond. She froze. Tell me more. Cross ground his teeth. His attraction to this woman was too much. Now she wanted him to tell her that he'd have to couple bond her while his cock was buried deep in her body, and she was in the middle of a climax? God. He groaned the word out, dropped his head in his hands. "You're killing me, woman." A surge of adrenaline followed the tingle and drove through him like a locomotive. The adrenaline was more powerful than anything he'd ever felt before. More powerful than the adrenaline on the most dangerous mission he'd ever been on. Though he couldn't remember it, he could barely remember his own name. That was how wrapped up he was in this woman. His mate. If she'd have him. So this couple bond happens when we. God damn it. He was never tongue-tied around women. Then again, he'd never had these feelings before. It was clear she had a light bulb moment. Her greenish-gold gaze showed understanding. A flush kissed her cheeks. That blush didn't help. His cock responded with a twitch. Cross scented her arousal, and it awakened both the bear and the man in him. It heightened his sexual drive. His cock strained, pushing, needing her. Wanting to possess, own, take, and brand himself deep within her. Wanting to be sure she never had any reason not to trust him. He'd have to bond her. "Do you want to?" Ariadne cocked her head to the side, a glint in her eye. "I do." A frown creased across his forehead. "You do what?" "I do want to." She placed a hand on his stomach, then her fingers crept their way up over his chest, wandering through the sprinkle of hair, up, over, then around his neck. Her eyes gleamed, locked on his, her cheeks flushed. Without taking his eyes off of hers, he reached for her top, took it by the hem, and raised it over her head. Her low-cut bra left the upper halves of her creamy breasts exposed for his viewing pleasure. Her chest moved with each breath, as if offering her body to him. "Ariadne." His voice rumbled from deep within, part his bear's. They'd gone too far. He couldn't push his bear back anymore. The fever to make her his forever was too strong. He picked her up and set her on the bed, then reached behind her, unhooked her bra and pulled it off, setting her breasts free. Her nipples stood at attention, dark pink pebbles waiting for his touch. He lowered his head, blew a breath on one, watching it swell and harden. Ariadne gasped, threw her head back, her legs spreading, probably unaware of the vision of sexiness she made. Certainly not aware of the depths to which his need ran. Cross took her tight bead in his mouth, drawing it in, sucking on it, letting his teeth graze it as she moaned and dug her fingers in his scalp. Her nails bit into his flesh. He reached for her other breast, weighed its fullness in his hand, squeezed it while his thumb and forefinger plucked and rolled its hardness. Ariadne squirmed on the bedspread, her hands fisting the fabric, pulling it up. Her moans took him to a place he wouldn't be able to leave. His body yearned to have her slickness wrapped around his shaft, milking his lust, pouring hers over his flesh. While his mouth pulled on her nipple, his hand drifted down, unbuttoned and unzipped her pants and tugged them over her hips. She raised her ass, and he slid them off. Her aroma rose, searing his senses with the essence of her flavor, pushing all inhibitions aside. Fuck being gentle. He shoved her legs apart, lowered his head into her trim patch, and drew her scent in, filling his lungs with her essence.
Chapter 19. Ariadne held her breath, her fingers entwined in Cross's hair, pushing him lower, wanting his mouth to take her the way he'd conquered her very soul. His tongue touched the top of her slit and slid through the folds. Ariadne gasped. Then his tongue touched her clit. A cry escaped her, one of desperation. She had to have him to be had by him. Cross? She couldn't control the sharpness of the need that drove her forward. "I need you." She spread her legs, putting her heels on the edge of the bed, opening herself to him. He spread her lips with his fingertips. "Fuck, I love your body. It's beautiful." He blew warm air on her. Its hotness turned cool as it passed over her lips. He spread her more, unhooding her tiny button, touching his tongue to the sensitive little bud. Ariadne jumped, as if an electric surge had touched her clit. The sensation journeyed to her nipples, and then, rather than stopping, it sent a bolt of desire straight to her head. He slipped a finger in. "So wet for me already." Ariadne moaned, heard the sound of his zipper, felt heat and fullness against her entrance. She reached down, touched his velvety steel shaft, its mushroom head throbbing against her fingertips. She wiggled, trying to get him to enter her channel. She wriggled closer to the edge of the bed. Cross took her ass in his hands. She grabbed his hips. If he didn't do it soon, she would pull him in her with a fierceness that was bound to hurt deliciously. With a thrust and a stretching, he filled her, pushing her to a place she'd never been before. Powered by desire, he pulled back, his head almost completely out, and drove back in, a groan on his lips. In and out, he thrust in the same way several times while a fierce feeling built in Ariadne. She couldn't pinpoint it, but somewhere in her mind or in her body or both, everywhere, a wave crested. She shoved it away, overwhelmed and confused by the intensity of it. Cross spread her thighs farther apart, driving deeper, then withdrew completely, leaving her with an empty desolation. Helping her to her feet, he turned her around and pressed her against the wall, her body flat on its surface. He spread her legs with his knees. She felt his cock against her lips and shimmied backward, needing its promise of pleasure. She moaned. Cross thrust, pushing her open while encasing his shaft deep within her. She grunted as he hit the back wall of her pussy and began a rhythmic fast pumping. Grabbing her hips, he pulled her tighter to his body. He raised a hand, brought his palm down on her ass. Smack. She flinched, her muscles tightening around him, grabbing his pulsing cock as he drove in deeper. A flash of light behind her eyelids was followed by a sizzling sensation in her veins as she climaxed. Her muscles tightened even more, milking him as he roared and leaned forward. Now. His voice was a hiss spiked with lust and need. Yes. 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 God, yes. She panted, the words torn from her throat. Another orgasm started, and she pushed back on him. He pulled her backward, grabbed her breasts with both hands while his cock was still firmly buried in her. At the base of his cock, surrounded by her lips and pulsing muscles, she felt him swelling. With a bellow, he bit into her shoulder and released his essence deep within at the same moment. A pulsating jet of heat hit the back of her channel, then traveled downward, coating her walls and his cock. I love you. His voice was low, a whisper as his breath traveled over the back of her neck. My mate. A sigh passed over Ariadne's lips. She wiggled against him, safe in the comfort of his love.
Chapter 20. Ariadne stretched, tugging her shoes on, and smiled at a patiently waiting Cross. He reached for her hand, pulling her toward the front door. Let's go for a walk. He held the door open, then exclaimed, Well, I'll be damned. Little Buck was waiting by the front porch. He was here when I pulled up, Ariadne said. Ben shot his mother. I heard him tell one of his men. The idea of it still made Cross burn with a renewed fury. I ruined his life. Her voice was hoarse. No, you didn't make Ben evil. His brand of evil is born that way. But he won't hurt any other innocents. Buck approached, tucking his head into Cross's palm. Cross leaned down, ran his fingers over the little deer's neck and body. Glad to see you made it. He glanced at Ariadne. I should let Mac know he's here. She texted me to say he was missing before hell broke loose. Think he'll stay? Ariadne reached out. Buck nuzzled her fingertips. I'm pretty sure he will. As long as we do. She gave Buck a gentle pat. Hey. Cross touched her shoulder. As long as we do. I heard you. She smiled at the expectant look on his face. That includes you. I'm not going anywhere. I guess I should tell you about my job. Does this have something to do with the high-tech room? Yeah. He didn't know how much he should overwhelm her with. I'm in a military group of sorts. We go on missions to bring evildoers in check. Okay. Confusion colored her voice. We serve 4 years, then take 1 year off to recharge. Then we can re-up. My brothers enlisted shortly after I did. I expect we'll be seeing them in the next few weeks. That's what you're doing now. Recharging. He kissed the tip of her nose. That's one way to describe it. I'm taking the year and spending it with you. Then we can decide if you want to stay here or go with me wherever I'm assigned. So I get a whole year to decide if I want to be with you. A twinkle in her eye got her a smack on the ass. Buck studied them with interest. No, woman, you're stuck with me for good. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. She rubbed her ass. Don't make that a habit, mister. She reached for the locket, rubbing it. That's special to you, isn't it? It was my mother's. It's Bug. That's how Ben found you. Oh my God. She jerked on the locket. Not wanting her to break the chain, Cross took her hands in his. Hold your hair back. He unfastened the locket, popped it open with his thumbnail, and moved the photo of a woman and her baby aside. See? Tiny. Black. Almost her death warrant. He removed it, crushed it between his fingers, and let it fall to the ground. Hard to believe something that small could have tracked me. Ariadne stomped on it, then ground it into the dirt. Hey, he's not coming after you. No one is. Montez and Ben aren't threats anymore. He put his arm around her, buried his nose in her hair, and inhaled her scent. She smelled delicious. Like sex. Like Ariadne. Like forever.
Thank you for listening. This has been a Shifters Forever Worlds book by L. Thorne. Stay tuned for more episodes. Don't forget to subscribe and to ring the bell to be notified of new releases.